3. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is a sad day in all the realms of fandom and fiction. For mythology and meaning itself, we mourn the loss of a titan. This is Get the Mic. And in the true spirit of Get the Mic, it's an off-the-cuff stream where your host on the left, Owl, and your
host on the right, Brock. Oh, like, what the fuck? Stop.
Hey, stop scratching that. Are here to pay tribute to Kentaro Miura.
The biggest dim.
As many of you know, this god amongst men passed just this week, and we wanted to do a stream dedicated to him. And as you can see on the left, the picture there, Guts, pretty much encapsulates our feelings.
Yeah, I basically, whenever I heard this, I couldn't stop thinking about this fucking panel. I mean, it's this exact emotion. It sort of like if George R. R. Martin died. The scope of the
sort
story
of, but
not being complete.
But I would say the difference is that Miura was trying to finish.
Yeah.
He knew his time was running short, and he tried to finish.
I mean, he was bringing other people onto the team. He really wanted to support the completion of the story, right?
And why wouldn't you when it's your masterpiece?
I mean, this was sort of his this is his magnum opus, right? Like everything he wanted to say about the nature of the world seemed to be packed into this.
And what are artists if they don't reflect the nature of the world unto us? It's actually a small wonder that Berserk takes place in a medieval setting.
Yeah, there's something about fantasy that can convey these. I think it's like a modern conduit into the mythological, you know. It helps us take that step into mythical thinking.
And it's interesting to think, too, what did our ancestors think? What was mythological for the classical era? Where hardly any records were kept before time. There was a Greek Dark Age between the times of the wars of Troy and, let's say, the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars in Greece. It's just interesting to think. If our art now is reflective of the medieval era, how did our ancestors conceptualize myth? More so than I think was actually preserved.
Well, it's far more imagistic than it is now, but I think that's part of what we're doing with Get the Mic is we're finding those images, right? That language of images that you can draw out. It's sort of like the language of the gods. You know, there's this nature of what you're trying to convey through the imagistic truth that's even greater than we can convey through language. And that definitely shows up here in it shows up in Get the Mic because that's what we're talking about, but it shows up in Berserk on, I think, a profound level, you know. So much so that it inspired things like Dark Souls to even exist, you know. Like the theme of Dark Souls is packed into Berserk, you know.
True. I think Dark Souls takes attributes from other fiction as well, but it's definitely hardwired in the mythology of Berserk.
it's so fundamentally rooted in
Like, for example,
the construction of Berserk.
in Dark Souls, Griffith makes the right choice.
Yeah, I mean, well, Berserk is an inversion, right? Like, it's an inversion of the hero, it's the inversion of the anti-hero, it's the inversion of the hero's path. I mean, like Guts is an orphan, right? But he's not the same type of orphan that you could say that like Jesus is. Like, Jesus doesn't have a father, right? He's born of a virgin. And so he's like half an orphan, right? That orphan idea shows up throughout. And you can take the orphan idea all the way down to orphan of cause, right? Like, Miyazaki was pulling from it.
True. But the orphan archetype is actually, I think, a step above in the hierarchy of difficulty, or maybe a step below in the hierarchy of difficulty, than having a father or an ancestry, which is fundamentally flawed.
Well, I think something about the orphan is like you can't appreciate something unless you don't have it. And so since the orphan archetype goes without the inherited like father experience or the inherited parental experience, the orphan automatically appreciates the value of having it in the first place. I think that's the way that it mythologically represents itself, right? So it's like the orphan can appreciate something that the average person could not, right? And so there's like relationship between the orphan and also having a reverence for the value of ancestry. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that in, let's say, Berserk, that idea possesses Guts for a good while until ultimately he realizes that the parental and paternal figure in his life is capable of evil. And at that point, that's when he realizes he can no longer be in that situation.
Yeah, it starts out that way, and then there's a progression from. You could say it's like progressing up the hierarchy, So it's to step outside the nature of the direct father, like the experienced father, to then the father that's nested inside of.
So I guess let's get into it. I think before we begin with some of our other slides, I just want to mention what this stream is going to be about. We're going to be talking about our favorite moments in Berserk, why they're important, and yeah, it's really a tribute to Miura. I think most of the things we have are from the manga. I think I put one clip from the movies, or one screenshot from the movies.
Yeah, there's a couple.
But most of it is Miura's art. We're really trying to preserve his spirit in this, and we hope that you enjoy listening to some of the things we find important to Berserk, as we do. We this is part of the grieving and mourning process, I'd say, celebrating the life of Kentaro Miura.
Yeah, I think that he was kind of a channeler of an archetypal truth with his art. He really brought out some fundamental experiences of human nature that inspired things like Dark Souls to even exist in the first place. I think that Dark Souls is an expression of the ethic of Guts' mode of being, is to say, like, well, we can't really make a Berserk game because that's boring because you're playing out a lot of scripted things, but what if you played the Guts experience, right? And that's kind of what Dark Souls was, and that experience is something. I mean, to be honest, like, you and I, Al, we wouldn't even be friends if it wasn't for that. Like we recognized each other at work as someone that was like worth interacting with beyond work, because we both had an affinity towards Dark Souls,
Well, an affinity and appreciation, which requires a level of understanding and cognitive recognition of what that game actually means.
And I was just on the edge of it, and you really introduced me to the mythological nature of Dark Souls, sort of delving into the substructure. I was really into the lore, really resonated with me for reasons that I didn't understand in the same way that like Evangelion did. But then
Then I told you, why does everyone want to be a bloathead?
essentially, yeah, I mean, you kind of introduced me into
And you were like, what do you mean?
that ethos, right?
Mm-hmm.
And through that, I came to appreciate it, and then I realized retroactively how much I appreciated Berserk, and I had introduced you to Berserk because, it was one of those things that it. I originally even paid attention to it because I knew that it inspired Dark Souls, but then there was something else about it that, even though I didn't understand it at the time that I was reading it, I knew that it was significant. I had to share it.
And so, just to preface the backstory we have with Berserk, Brock introduced me to it, is true, and I actually was kind of resistant to watching it, or I didn't read it at all.
Right. I mean, you're not a fan of anime, so.
I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna watch something just because, especially just because it's anime. So I started watching it, and I didn't really think much of it until the last couple of episodes, when the eclipse happens, and I kind of looked up from my computer screen, and I was like, well, what is going on? And I watched the rest of that, and I recognized the real malevolence that was being expressed, and I kind of had to explore where it was coming from, and so I rewatched the whole series.
In the context of
And
everything
by
before
series,
that is
I mean
completely
at first you just loaned me the movies, and so I rewatched all the
was
movies.
it the Blu-rays?
Yeah.
Or was it the original series?
No, it was the Blu-rays
Oh,
first,
yeah.
and then I was like, hey, I watched all those Blu-rays. Give me the original
The
90s
original is
anime.
so good.
And so then
It's
I watched
the
the
only
original one.
real. I feel like that is the only true adaptation.
So far. And that is actually, I would say, for any fans of Berserk listening to this, that is our real saving grace, is that it gets a real adaptation beyond the 90s anime. And what I mean by that is it gets a adaptation at least on par with the Golden Age arc adaptation of the 90s anime throughout the entire series. So I even want the ship arc. I know a lot of people think it's boring.
I think Ganishka's cool. I mean, one
Well,
of the coolest moments, which we're going to talk about later, is tied to Ganishka,
oh, absolutely.
And so these other arcs that no one really talks about, like the boat arc, right? And we also have panels about the boat arc.
It's actually a ship, but
The
I
ship
know
arc.
what you mean.
Yeah.
No, everyone calls it the boat arc. I understand.
The galley arc, the
it's
dinghy arc.
Technically a ship, but
Yeah.
it's got more than one mast.
But the whole idea is I mean, people had a bad time with it, but it introduced something that's ultimately, undeniably archetypal to the story. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's something about the manga, or sorry, about the anime, that you can't just leave the anime. The way that it ends, it's like,
Oh, it's devastating.
it's so horrible. It's crushing, right?
It's a tragedy, and that's something I think that we've really lost in the present day. Because let me ask you something, Brock. Is tragedy marketable?
No, I mean, tragedy is something that
Is comedy marketable?
truly, no, not anymore. There was a time that comedy was marketable.
So what's marketable now?
What's marketable now is just affirmation bias.
I mean, I would still say. I think about Endgame, Avengers Endgame. Everyone, no spoilers, but it's a comedy.
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately a comedy, and the toxic nature of our interpretation of what comedy means to us as a culture bleeds through that movie.
And I think that's actually what makes tragedy so important, is that we do not have a cynical interpretation of tragedy. Tragedy is so profound that it kind of transcends our cynical nature, whereas comedy and satire, for example, make our reactions towards those genres more or less, uh, and I would say more actually.
Well, I would say nihilism denies the value of a tragedy. You know.
I don't know. Because, like, let's say a nihilistic time, the late 90s, Titanic came out. It's a tragedy. I don't even like that movie, but people resonated with it because the tragic nature is harder to overcome with cynicism.
What I mean is that nihilism denies the love that creates the tragedy out of the Titanic, and therefore doesn't view the Titanic as a tragedy.
Okay,
Nihilism views things as a zero-sum game, right?
Yes, but what I'm saying is tragedy is more resilient to nihilism than comedy. Comedy is easier to criticize than tragedy.
Sure, yeah. I mean, well, nobody is exempt from death. And so tragedy is universal. Whereas comedy, you're not guaranteed a valuable or enjoyable life, right?
And what we
But
mean
you
by
are guaranteed a
let's
death.
just quickly sum up. What we mean by comedy is a story in which the hero conquers evil and has a happy ending. And tragedy, where the hero is unable to conquer evil and the ending is not happy. More or less.
More or less, yeah.
I mean, I don't want to put it in too many. I don't want to go off on a huge tangent here.
I think that's fair for what we're talking about.
And as it relates to Berserk, tragedy, absolute.
Yeah, I mean,
And
as
it's
far
so
as the
relatable.
anime goes, it's probably the most tragic that I've seen. You know,
Okay, but the manga is not, as far as we know, continuing. So I would say the entire story is a tragedy at this point.
no, the story, the meta story, the literal story, it's all a tragedy.
Everything. There's no way you can interpret Berserk unless you like stopped reading at chapter 20.
Well, here's the thing. I think that Berserk is a comedy. I think that,
But we never got there.
but we didn't get there. But I think that from everything I know about it and my interpretation of the stories and what I think that Miura's understanding of the topics are, I think they lead me to a comedy, but we didn't get it, you know. So the meta story supersedes.
I disagree.
Okay.
I think that the theme.
Well, I think that actually it kind of ties us into our panels now because, we can talk through some of our scenes and make our defenses for that. I can start out because it's literally the next thing.
Okay.
Because the first scene I want to talk about is the coming together of Guts and Casca, right? Whenever there's this experience where they're both laid low. So Guts and Casca, after Guts transcends Griffith, right? He goes off on his own and meets back up with Casca after he's been his own independent sort of entity. And, you know, you can say that they fall in love, but I mean, it's ultimately like they come to appreciate each other, and because of that, we have a physical manifestation of that. But what happens is that Guts needs to reveal his vulnerability to her, and she needs to reveal her vulnerability to him. So that's literally what they do. So before they copulate, before they actually come together, Casca, she confesses to Guts her own vulnerabilities, which is, whenever she was almost raped by a man and Griffith saved her, and she kind of talks to him about where she really came from and why she's embarrassed, right? Because she wants to be viewed as a woman, and there's this, she has to verbally say this to Guts and make sure he understands that, doesn't even understand, but respects the fact that she's not just another soldier, right? It's the difference between the two that brings them together in the first place, right? And Guts has to reveal his vulnerability to her then, as a result, and as he is revealing his vulnerability to her, it's like he sees himself in her whenever they get together because of his treatment at the hands of Donovan. And so whenever he's with her, he sees himself and then enacts that on her. So there's this amazing interchange between the two of them where he experiences this sort of like humility or like this ego death through coming into contact with her, right? He confesses what he went through and then comes onto the same level as her. And, we kind of talked about that in Dragon Ball, where it's like that ego death, like, brings Bulma and Yamcha down to the point that they can see each other as people rather than viewing what they deserve as, like, this, like, abstract perfection, right? And they talk about each other's scars, and that's why the chapters where they get together is called Wounds, because it's like they're licking each other's wounds. I just think it's beautiful. Like, it's something that shows us that Miura was not, like, he wasn't creating just this edgelord fantasy, dark fantasy series where it's like, oh, and Guts was raped whenever he was a kid, and that's because it's dark and edgy. It's like, no, this is something that it's that in and of itself is mythological, and the resolution of that is something that's really important, that the masculine spirit is something that perseveres through something like that.
Yeah, I think that was a lot. You said a lot there. I think I want to touch on a couple things. First of all, you talking about the spirit in Dragon Ball. You were talking about the. Oh man, I lost it. What were you saying about Dragon Ball?
I don't know. There is a lot. I mean, I feel like I've just had a lot to say in general about
You're
it.
talking about the ego death. That's right.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Let me mention that. So, there's more moments of ego death, I would say, in Dragon Ball that are more representative than what we have. But as far as it is in Berserk, for sure it's for Guts specifically. This instance is that mention of ego death, and it's where he's able, and ego death is actually something very positive. Most people are able to figure their way out of it, but in this instance it is something that Guts has to work through, and seeing the helpless nature of Casca kind of triggers that within him.
Yeah, he has to recognize her vulnerability as his own vulnerability, and it also speaks to him because it's like part of the development of his character was this weakness that was imprinted on him, But I think that's just it. It's just powerful, It's something that it was really effective to me when I read that chapter.
To be honest, this is the full circle nature of, let's say, Goku taking Bulma's panties, the recognition of the vulnerability of the weak to the strong, more broadly, I'd say, than in Dragon Ball, because this is just those that are helpless, women and children, to those who have power. And specifically, I think Donovan being the one who does it and Guts having to deal with it here is particularly poignant. It kind of brings his character full circle, and this happens right before a major event, which we'll get to in this stream.
Yeah, well, I think that if you look at the next frame as well, it's like, so we see on the left here that he is rebuked by his father figure, right? His father is telling him in his dreams, "You should have died." And he remembers that, like, that he killed his own father, and he has this regret that, like, how would I put it? That he is inferior, and that he should not have, that his father should have lived instead of him, right? That he's inferior to him. And so you have this portrayal of the removal of the father's head, and saying you should have died, and he is experiencing himself as aggressor and himself as a victim at the same time, and is bringing himself into integration, you could say, right? And it's such a powerful thing to happen in this story, and it's really represented by Casca's experience of them coming together, because she's very self-conscious. There's a whole scene of her talking about that the fact that she doesn't want him to see her scars, and that she wants him to see her as a woman and not a warrior. And his response to her self-consciousness is what I think takes Berserk above just the edgy dark fantasy. His response is to tell her, nobody lies their way into a body with this many scars. He respects her for her lived experience, right? It's this like recognition of the universality of his experience, right? It's this whole integration. And what she is to him is extremely important, in the fact that that's denigrated so extremely in the following events is what makes this a tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to, let's say, articulate the idea further, what Guts is saying here is that there would be no purpose or no advantage for Casca to lie her way into what she is.
Yeah, and he's telling her that he sees her as a complete person, right? That her scars make her who she is.
As a soldier and a woman.
Right.
And it's something that Guts is able to finally bring to fruition. But why does he choke her?
I think that is because he needs to recognize the aspect of the shadow of Gambino in himself,
The Beast of Darkness?
which is the original representation of the Beast of Darkness, and it gets explained further.
Are you
as we
saying
get
that
into it
the
further.
father, the tyrannical father, can be the embodiment of the Beast of Darkness within us all?
I would say that the shadow is born from the tyrannical father. And it's something that we have to integrate into ourselves to understand.
It's true. If all
part
of us
of
were
what
turned
makes us
into
who we are.
babies in this instant, there would be no shadow, would you say?
Right. We build a shadow through the negative experience of the masculine.
Interesting.
But, this is because, well, I mean, that's why we don't have any picture of it, but this is why whenever he starts integrating the Beast of Darkness, he bites Casca and leaves a bite mark on her.
Yeah, I
On her
didn't think
tit.
that'd be YouTube friendly.
Yeah, but
So-
but that's the same idea, right? It's this sort of like pure aggression that is forced into his character whenever he's young, But also he has to recognize that in relationship to himself. But yeah, that I just the first thing I wanted to talk about was this scene, because this is probably my favorite scene in Berserk, is whenever he and Casca sort of both lay down their egos to each other and come to understand each other. And we see that Casca is sort of this nourishing element for the hero, right? The archetypal hero. And it also sets up the mythological.
Is she a damsel in distress?
No, she's not. She is the archetypal sort of. She's the power of the archetypal feminine,
What I would say that is, and I think this works in the reverse as well, is that Casca being the ideal feminine is that she is the maximum complement to the masculine, and Guts is the maximum complement to the feminine.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that happens in this chapter. I could have gotten like 10 slides of this chapter to all be relevant to this conversation.
Oh, I know.
It's
I mean, we're going to be going for a couple hours
Yeah.
if you guys are
I
if,
couldn't.
if
I couldn't
anyone
devote that
watching
much
is
to it.
down, like we're gonna be going for a while.
Yeah, there's a lot to say
Miura
about it.
there's a lot to say, and
But yeah, I mean,
that's
I
all.
could have screenshotted so many times throughout this chapter because Guts. Essentially, what happens in this chapter is that they're together, and then Guts, whenever he sees Casca as this vulnerable person, he sees himself, and as a result, enacts this aggression on her. Regrets it, slams his fist on this tree, and confesses to her that he killed his own father figure, and he's weeping openly. And then she embraces him and says that that's okay, and she accepts him as he is. And there's this whole transformation for him where he integrates himself through being accepted by her for the evil he's had to integrate into himself through the negative aspect of the father. And the fact that Griffith is this I mean, I don't want to just say outrightly evil, but this covetous nature that in the destruction of what Guts is rapes that.
I mean, Griffith is that which seeks to exceed God.
Yeah,
Lightbringer, Lucifer.
Yeah, it's the Luciferian
okay,
worship
I just
want to
say right now, I am lamentful that Griffith will never receive the justice that he deserves.
Well, you said to me earlier that he never pays for what he gets. I think that's it. The Luciferian, I think of Griffith like an anti-Christian figure, like the Antichrist, right? Because there's this inversion throughout all of Berserk, like Guts being the orphan, the parentless hero's journey archetype, but coming from a corpse rather than a living woman. But he has no father, right? You know, and the archetypal hero has no earthly father. I mean, across Superman, Dragon Ball. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, right? The archetypal hero's journey. And so, well, let's think of an archetypal hero who has a negative father figure, right? Like Luke from Star Wars, right? Where he has no father, but then he has a father, but then the father is a negative archetypal force on him that he has to transcend.
I mean, he can transcend it because he's been invigorated by the power of the super father, the spiritual super father in Yoda.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing. It's a trinity of fathers, right? You have your heavenly father, which is Yoda. You have your ancestral father, which is Darth Vader. And you have, I suppose, your earthly father, which would be Obi-Wan Kenobi. Which
right.
Luke encounters all three.
But there's this inversion with Guts where he has his earthly father, which is Gambino, which is a negative father, right? And through that, I feel like that's the point of an inverted pyramid that leads him into this darkness that he has to fight against, the struggle that he has because he's living in what Jung would call like the second half of the Age of Pisces, the anti-Christian era, right? So he's almost like he relates to our experience in that he's fighting against the way that the world has been inverted, you know. And it also kind of makes me think of Bloodborne, where it's like your struggle is against this not nihilistic, but this very futile this fight, and that's why Guts is called like the struggler, right?
I mean, not just Bloodborne, but Dark Souls as well.
I mean, there's a definite struggler aspect.
Is the world saved? I mean, if you choose either ending of Dark Souls, is the world saved?
I mean, there's no you don't get to be an archetypal savior, you know,
because your path is filled with corruption.
Well, it's the integration of that corruption, right? It's the dark souls that you have to take into yourself to integrate.
Are you saying that you can have a dark soul with a heart of gold?
that is the reason that we are friends in the first place, is it not?
Why is that? Explain it.
That's a song.
Let's plug it.
Yeah, I mean, let's plug it in, because the reason that we know each other at all
Brock and Owl.
is that at a job we worked together at in the past, I was playing a song by Windmills, and I think it's Bring Out the Sun, that says, "You can have a dark soul with a heart of gold." And when he heard I was playing this song, he approached someone who worked for me and said, "Oh, you're a fan of this?" And I heard him ask that, and I walked in and said, "Actually, no, I'm a fan of it. I was playing it." And we immediately bonded over our affinity for Dark Souls. And for me, I mean, I didn't have like a mythological interpretation of Dark Souls, but I knew that we had, as soon as we started talking about what we liked about the series, that we had something in common and what we appreciated about it. And yeah.
I mean, even though I enjoy PvP, and Brock doesn't really. Brock's here and there about PvP. Even though that's the case, I mean, the story has been something that's sacred to me since I really understood it. When I first played Dark Souls, I did not understand the story. In fact, I didn't even know Solaire's name. I called him Epic Sun Guy. Epic. I gave him the moniker of that because I knew he was important. But, yes, to say that Brock and I met because of Souls and Berserk is not something untrue. But to get back to the point here, in Berserk, Guts is no saint. Guts makes some very, very poor decisions. And the wounds that you're mentioning here in Chapter 2, I think is that vulnerability of self-consciousness coming to the fold that is poignant in the unification of Guts and Casca.
Yeah, I love this page. Miura he's recognized as one of the greatest manga artists of all time, and as I was looking back through some of the chapters that are really important, I saw this page here, and it's so powerful in representing the themes of what Berserk is about. You can look at what I was saying before, that Guts is an orphan, right? He was born from a corpse hanging from a tree. It's almost like he's being painted as the postmodern, right? The orphan child of the woman hung upon the tree.
Hold on. Let's stop there because there's more historical context to bring into it. Like we have established in Myth and Meaning, Japanese culture was pretty much destroyed and had to be rebuilt after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say that this culture was born from the corpse of the culture before it. And I think especially after that era, we had to kind of kill the old way. Because let's say the modern era, right, which was late 1800s, early 1900s, the modern era really died after World War II. And we have the nuclear era. And so from the corpse
you could call
of
it
that,
like the information age, right?
and so from the corpse of that, a new hero arises, that which struggles against existence itself.
The existential dread, right?
But in the context of a mythological setting being the medieval era.
Right. It's the dark fantasy is the fourth quarter of the medieval era, right? It's sort of that point in time where it's questioning the nature of the medieval existence itself.
Think about this. I want you to think about this real quick, Brock. We are closer in age to the people who lived in Renaissance Italy, Michelangelo, Donatello, um, Leonardo da Vinci, let's say,
Right.
um, and the Medicis, and we're closer to them in age than they were to Rome.
I mean, that's the acceleration of our experience of time, you know.
No, I think it's exactly indicative as to why Berserk takes place in the medieval era, is because it's not that long ago. And we're not that different than the people that lived then. And if you think that we are so much better than they are, I'm sorry, but you're possessed by the spirit of arrogance, and I feel sorry for you.
You are possessed by an ideology that tells you that you're that you have an inherited recognition of the experience of life itself that is superior than the inherited experience of your ancestors. And that is toxic. It is self consuming and is weakening you.
And I also think that's what's indicative here. You're born from the corpse of your ancestors. At
You
the very
are
least.
nothing without them.
Right. And so Guts travels along this path, as jagged and as unsophisticated as it is, as, let's say, as scarring as it was, to just survive.
Well, you can see his experience represented along the path too. You see as it works its way down, you see the wing of the hawk right before the wing of the demon, right? Or the wing of the negative aspect of the top of the hierarchy when he experiences it, right? You see the angel and demon for him there, right? But
well, I would say, like,
an
okay, so
inversion
it's
of it.
basically, just to summarize for anyone that may be listening and not watching actively, the picture shows the origin of Guts at the Tree of Corpses, where he's born to the corpse of his mother, which you can conceive of as the corpse of the maternal being the chaotic, and the tendency to go against, let's say, order. Born from the spirit of that, Guts comes forth and first encounters the... Is that the... Hold on. I want to say that's the Skull Knights stuff. It's like thorns and skulls.
I think that's just his recognition of death. It's
Okay.
very early in life.
Yeah,
for
I
him.
would say that too. Recognition
Because-
of death. Then the Beharit he encounters, followed by the Band of the Hawk, which is the Golden Age, and the encounter with Zod, which is really the beginning of the end.
It's
them.
his first apostle encounter, but it's also sort of this beastly representation of the top of the masculine hierarchy.
I would say not only bestial, but unholy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as evidenced by the wings.
And all of that leads, and this is Boy Guts here, which is interesting because it's a more vulnerable persona of Guts, meaning that the path that he's trailed has led him to be more vulnerable. Well, at least consistently vulnerable since he was a child.
Yeah, I mean that's to say that in spirit he is not as mature as he is physically, right?
Absolutely, because right now in the story, like, he can wield that sword easily, but in this panel, he's dragging it behind him.
Right, and it's showing the path that he's dragged it behind him from his birth. That he has lived his life by the point of the sword, by his ability to survive within his physical hierarchy.
And it's left him spiritually as a child.
Right.
Whereas the spirit that we're about to encounter is so much more powerful. Here it is. This is Griffith's encounter. And like we said, it's kind of out of order. We're just going over some of the favorite parts of
Yeah,
Berserk.
I mean, I don't even want to follow necessarily the order of these pictures either, but figured we should have at least something to show. But yeah, I mean, the idea of evil for Griffith is like, it is the opposite of what we've been talking about. It is the rejection of the father, it is the rejection of tradition. The idea of evil is the ego as the self rather than the ego as something to promote something greater than itself. Right?
It's the spirit which possesses school shooters.
I mean, it's, as Ian McGilchrist has talked about, the master and his emissary. It's to say that your persona is greater than the self, which is not true. Your persona is a construct of the self. It's a tool that's used by the self. But the true self is something that transcends the persona. The idea of evil really exists as this all-consuming desire by the Luciferian projection into the world that the self is greater than some idea above itself, or that the self is rooted in the ego rather than something more universal, something more shared, right? Something that you can recognize in somebody else as well, something that brings us together rather than makes you something that can't recognize the virtue outside of the self. And so that ego possession, being that idea of evil, is something that it's not even canon. Miura actually was like, oh, that's not a canon idea because it was too on the nose. And that gives us a bit of a hint here that Miura was onto something that he knew was mythological.
Which also, I want to bring up something that Peterson talks about, which is that artists don't know and necessarily can't know about the mythological nature of what they produce, which I don't think is necessarily true.
I think it's partially true. He actually had a podcast not too long ago with the artist who did the illustrations for his book, Beyond Order, and asked them questions about their motivation behind certain artistic choices they made for these illustrations. And the further he went into the podcast, the closer he got, and then eventually revealed that there were aspects of the art that he could explain better than the artist themselves, right? Because there were subconscious projections in the way that they portrayed the ideas that they did not understand. And it was a real proof. The proof is in the pudding, right? It was brilliant, honestly. To me, it was so smart for him to talk about it this way because it really shows that the ideas that he's talking about and the ideas we're talking about transcend our more logical understanding, right? They
And
manifest
more
themselves
importantly, are
artistically.
actually true.
Yeah, they're a truism in the sense that they're part of the common human experience that manifests itself through conscious and unconscious representations of our life. And you can see it expressed throughout time in art as well, but I just thought that was good, good as an example. But
Right.
anyway,
And I mean, as far as what I want to say, I mean, I have some things to say about the idea of evil as well. I think that the idea of evil and it being cut out, right? Too on the nose, first of all. I agree with you. But the idea of evil itself, it's a heart that portrays this, and that's a very human construct.
well, I mean, Solzhenitsyn, I think he is recognized as saying that the line between good and evil runs through all human hearts, something along those lines.
Right. There's no coincidence that Miura made this a heart.
Yeah.
and particularly because I mean, let's say in prehistory, maybe not even prehistory, ancient history, uh, gods were not thought of to bleed. Therefore, their hearts wouldn't be pumping right. I mean, it's not a very godly thing to have a vulnerable organ. And so here, the heart is the idea of evil. And the knowledge of vulnerability is therefore the root of evil. And I think you're right, it's on the nose, but I just want to explain that a little further for anyone listening what exactly it is.
Well, look at this representation on screen, right? So the top half, we have the light spewing out of it. We see the representation of that light above it. But below it, right? What's below the heart, the bottom half, or you could say the negative half, right? The downward half of it spirals out. It swirls together. And we see the manifestation of that below, right? Which is the void, the swirling tentacles below, right? And so this idea of evil is like the negative half of our heart, of our feeling. It's rooted all the way down, and you could think of the yin yang.
Right. It almost leads to our bestial nature.
Well, I mean, look at the two images, and is it not a yin yang? The swirling light with the dark in the middle and the dark in the light. I mean, it's this coming together of those two ideas.
On these two, you mean?
Yeah. You know, the inversion of the two, right? Which is like the upward swirl and the downward swirl. The yin and the yang is what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Right, and the idea of evil lies within those dark spots.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you know, that idea being part of all of Berserk, I mean, you think about like the beasts of darkness and what that means in terms of, you know, the Eastern representation. And I think that's part of what makes it common to what we've talked about with Dragon Ball as well, is this Eastern interpretation of light and dark, or of like the balance between positive and negative. I think that's why Miyazaki cut this out and didn't want to call it canon, because it was like he's kind of showing his
Miura.
hand.
Just want to correct you there.
Oh, my bad.
Said Miyazaki.
Fucking A. Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? Because we came to understand this because we both really appreciated Miyazaki. And then
But Miyazaki in turn,
yeah.
well, I think Miyazaki not only appreciated Miura, obviously, but he also appreciated a lot of European myth.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Miura did too. Berserk takes place in Europe, more or less.
Yeah, and I mean that's why we see things the way they are in Dark Souls as well, because I think that there's, well, what is Dragon Ball, but supposedly an iteration Journey to the West, right? So there's this wisdom that we've found across multiple different properties that seems to be a merging of Eastern and Western thought.
And I think that's divine. The merging of the best parts of those two.
Yeah, I think it comes with a certain level of humility to say that, like, this is a part of my hemispheric culture with respect to another culture, to try to come together to find the commonality between the two, right?
And there is. And that's the thing. That's what I'm saying. Good has no demographic, because when things are made in that fashion, they gain universal appeal. And in this case, universal disdain, because the idea of evil is persistent throughout all cultures. Its roots as well, like you said, are universal.
Yeah, I mean, it manifests itself across both cultures, but I think that both Dragon Ball and Berserk,
I would say all cultures.
yeah, I mean, I say both as in East and West, but yeah, all culture, and then Dragon Ball and Berserk are both trying to show the commonality between. Every time I say between, it comes out really Southern, which is really strange. But yeah,
Well,
the commonality between
I
the
mean, let's be honest, Brock. You did grow up in Texas.
two, Tekkas, yeah, and we're some beers and mead deep.
I mean, I grew up on the East Coast, so I don't really have that accent.
Yeah, well,
So, Brock, real quick, when you take your car in to change your what is it?
my
What?
blinker fluid.
No, it's more regular than that. What?
What
You
are
know,
you
it's every
talking
like
about?
it's every like 3,000, 6,000 miles. What do you get changed in your car?
Oh, my oil.
Oh, your oil,
Yeah,
you
I
say.
change my oil in my car sometimes.
Okay. Just making sure it was oil and not
Not what?
oil.
What is that? Who would say that?
I mean, I've heard in Texas. Just saying. Texas. All right, anyways, back on
Now
topic.
this is true get the mic content right here.
I mean, I just wanted to mention Texas there. So you were trying to say between
So between So between the two, you can see that there's some commonality. some common themes in morality. No, but it's seriously a common theme though, because I think it has a recognition of where we exist as a sort of postmodern society. It's where we sit with this postmodern society. See,
well, yeah, I think both Dragon Ball and Berserk are pieces of fiction for a postmodern society. But let's go ahead and I think we have another thing to address here. And we're gonna come back to this later. But I wanted to mention for anyone watching, I knew this imagery before I saw it. It's very strange. When I saw it, it was almost deja vu. Like I knew I'd seen it. It's something familiar.
yeah, I mean, there's something weird about it's almost like a dreamlike state, right? This place that is recognizable with the Griffith experience, like in shallow water. I think that kind of ties into our archetypal experience of water, but it's like I have these memories of myself in water, as far as my dreams go.
I mean, this image is so complicated. I can hardly begin to describe it. And I think too the image we have later will better illustrate this because it's in color. I think it's kind of necessary for this because I've almost seen the exact image in color in my dreams before. Something unholy. It's a spirit though, for sure.
Okay, well, I want to point at this image, right?
Let's point at it. Go ahead.
Okay, so on the right-hand side of the image, we have an hourglass shape. In the middle of that hourglass shape is the bayolet, right? We have an upward spike, a point that is negative, and we have a downward point, which looks more positive. The reason I say that is because one's dark and one's light. The way that Griffith sees his experience is that the bayolet is leading him towards salvation. The salvation is pointing at a jagged spike, a dark spike coming up from below. He uses that to try to kill himself. And I think that this image is representative of what his experience is. He pulls this up out of the unconscious and holds it in front of himself and observes what the bayolet represents. The bayolet, well, how would you describe what a Baelit is?
Well, let's first let's back it up. So the Beherit
The Beherit
is gifted to Griffith before we meet him in the story.
is something that he's already been carrying with himself.
And who gives him the Beherit?
Is it? It's like a gypsy woman.
It's Ubik.
It's Ubik?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I remember that now. That's right.
So, a manifestation of the devil himself. That and by the devil himself, I mean the spirit of the God hand, which is the spirit of the adversary.
Which is springing up from the idea of evil.
Well, it is, but I was going to get to that, which is the spirit of the antagonist. And what does antagonist mean? It means that which moves. It's that thing that causes the action. The evil that rears its head for the hero to conquer. Always must a hero have that.
The ego.
It could be the ego. It could be tyranny. It could be a lot of things. But in this instance, the manifestation of the spirit of the adversary rears its head and gifts unto Griffith the idea
It's
of destiny.
Not only that, but like destiny is a complicated word for this because it's like the inherited victimhood of what the Beherit seems to represent. Because as Skull Knight describes it, he says it's like the culmination of human suffering into a droplet, right?
Well, each Beherit, right, is one of those.
It makes me think of
It's their last tier.
well,
I think is what the Skull Knight describes it as. Each Beherit,
Well-
but this one is actually a red one, which
Well-
is the Egg of the King, which is a unique one.
think
Let's
of
be
this.
specific.
Think of this, okay? Think of Berserk as a pure inversion of the hero mythos, okay?
Hold
Now,
on, before why can we take that premise?
Because think of the Dragon Balls and the Wish. Okay? I like to think of Berserk as well, I say I like to think of, but it seems to pull this way where this droplet of it's like the negative aspect of chaos, the inherited victimhood, right?
Whoa. That's such a complicated phrase.
I know.
Inherited victimhood. Let's define that before we proceed.
Okay, so you think of like potential and negative potential, or the definition of negative potential is like that which holds you down. So what makes you a victim of fate, rather as the opposite, which is what you've inherited by your fate. Like the positive aspect of fate, negative aspect of fate. What you've inherited that empowers you, what you've inherited that makes you weaker.
Wait. But that's not fate. What you've inherited is not fate.
Well, I mean, fate in the sense that you don't have any power over it.
Okay. I don't think that necessarily encapsulates the idea of fate, but go on.
What I mean is that there is what I would believe to be the positive heroic.
Let's say an inherited presupposition to the heroic, an inherited presupposition to the anti-heroic.
Right. Well, the heroic aspect being...
I don't think fate's the right word. That's
right.
all.
Well, let's say that you've inherited a circumstance. The positive is to look at that circumstance and see the opportunity within it. The negative is to look at that circumstance and see how it holds you down. Right? So you have empowerment versus victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what I'm saying with the positive and the negative. So what I'm saying about this is that Griffith is led now to ultimate victimhood and then becomes the embodiment of victimhood itself. in the world and manifest something so negative that only the elevation of victimhood itself to the top of the hierarchy, a full inversion, could give us. And I think that that's why Berserk is so positive, because it's a response to a nihilistic impulse. It's to say that the suffering is worth it, rather than to say that power for the sake of power is the value that could even possibly be pursued.
Whew.
That's a lot, I know.
You made a lot of jumps in that last couple sentences.
But to view the Falcon of, or the Hawk of Light, right? So let's say that Griffith is what a generation could consider to be the hero, right? And how does he get where he gets? Well, he betrays his own virtues at every turn, right? He sends guts to murder a child. He forces himself onto Charlotte. He is power for the sake of power, right?
And this is his reward.
And his reward is sacrifice everybody else, right? But only at your lowest point, because you choose then pure ego, right?
I think we're missing. I think you're missing something.
All right.
But we're gonna get to it.
Oh, let's get to it.
I want to continue. No, because I want to do it whenever I have the slide with color.
Well, let's go to the next slide then.
Let's continue. So we have then here. Whoa, what am I even seeing? Oh, that's the Skeleton Knight.
I love the way that these two images look together, because so what Griffith does obviously is he decides to kill himself because he is unable to fulfill what he thinks his potential is, right? He's laid himself low and can't fulfill it.
Does he kill himself?
He can't even kill himself. Instead, what he does...
Why can't he kill himself?
I think of it as sort of this idea as a germ. This way of thinking
do you know the story of Napoleon on St. Helena Island?
Enlighten me.
He wanted to kill himself, but he thought of so highly of himself, and he thought himself so resilient. And this is kind of maybe a hyperbolic tale, but it's a parable nonetheless. That he took so much poison, he actually threw up most of it, and ended up not dying from a dose that would actually be lethal. It's akin to something like that. The ego was so powerful that it actually protected that person in which it is possessing.
Well, so let's talk about that in terms of Griffith, because Griffith is almost pure ego, right? It's almost to say that, like, this is as close to the manifestation of the ego as the humanistic could get. And so he's not pure ego, but you could imagine he's the extension of the greatest human ego manifestation that you could get as a mortal, right? And so in experiencing what is happening with the eclipse, he is, I guess you could say, at the top of the ego hierarchy, right? He is the one who gets to decide the sacrifice that other people embody, right? He gets to extrapolate his sacrifice onto other people and sacrifice himself for his own desire.
I mean, that is what happens, but I think it means more than that.
Well, yeah, I mean...
So what happens to a person who's possessed by ambition and has the means to sacrifice? Because it's not just that it's not just that Griffith sacrifices for his desire, but the fact that he has the means to do it is another step. It's one who and this is something that I've actually wanted to write about, is that it can be only someone who has been in the realm of competency and exceeded in such that can cause the greatest terror.
Yeah, it's a complicated enough idea that I don't even have much to say on it. I mean, the I guess the best way to describe it is the picture on the left. You see the reflection of the moon off of this reflective surface around Griffith's head, right? It's like,
Well, I also want to mention too, the egg of the king is possessed by Griffith for a reason. The spirit in which he embodies is that which takes control. And
well, it's
we've
almost
already
like
established.
it's like the idea that by the merit of yourself you're a king, right? It's like people saying that like that there's some royalty in their bloodline or in what they've inherited, or that there's some
It's not even that.
genetic dominion for them,
It
right?
doesn't even have to be that. It's to say that you believing that you are better and above other people is the first step on the road to becoming a tyrant.
Yeah. I mean, just like by inheritance, right? By the nature of who you are inherently, right? That you should or that you would even be able to say that you were, right?
Exactly. And that's the thing. That's what Griffith manifests that attitude early on, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, we see the first hint of that in the scene where Guts kills a child for the sake of Griffith.
No, we see that way
dream.
before that. Think about the first fight with Guts and Griffith.
The one where
Griffith begins to try to treat him as if someone who is a pawn. But Guts existing outside of that, let's say, the sea of destiny, as a carp that can fly above the waters, he's able to prove Griffith wrong as far as people having true divinity and the divinity of the individual. And the divinity of the individual against the conspiring of tyranny, and the spirit that exists against that is somewhat of the inspiration that I find in Guts.
Yeah, I mean, Guts exists as this individualistic or individuated spirit. And we see that even in his first experience with being bombarded by Griffith's men, whenever he's originally just a sellsword. And his interactions with that, and then throughout his interactions, even within the Band of the Hawks, and then eventually his departure from the Band of the Hawks, has to do with that individuation.
And he's the only one that's able to do it. Casca's not. But real quick, I wanted to get back on track on the images we have on screen. This is Griffith summoning the Eclipse and the Skull Knight going to save
Guts and Casca.
yes.
Well, the masculine and,
And
feminine
I mean, I don't.
heroic archetypes.
I think we have an image later that we're really going to get into the Skull Knight, so stay tuned. But I think we're going to go on.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit about
So
the God Hand here.
right, let's talk about the God Hand, which springs forth from the idea of evil. What is a hand?
Well, we don't have a picture of it. I should have gotten a picture of it, but it's the intro of every episode. It's the destiny of mankind, the will of some transcendental being. Right, and we see the hand holding the Bayolet.
And what is the Beharit?
It is the meaning of suffering.
The Beherit's the meaning of suffering.
The Beherit seems to be the interpretation of the meaning of the suffering of existence itself. You can see Guts as the struggler, and then you can see Griffith as the person who takes it and makes it into something that they have inherited, or that they own, that owes something to them. Right? It's got a face on it that wakes up, that represents their.
All right, let's distill this, because I think you're saying a lot of things, and I agree with a lot of them. But let's kind of distill what you're saying. So the Beherit is a distillation of human suffering. That's what the first thing you said. The egg of the king. What are the difference between those two? Because you have the red Beherit and you have the regular gray Beherit, which Guts finds in the first chapter of the manga.
Now this I have not worked out, so I'm really just thinking off the top of my head on this one.
Okay, so I have some analysis on this.
Okay, I'm gonna throw it over to you.
Okay, hold on. So the gray Beherits, those are the ones that are made of the tiers, the final tier of a mortal that is slain by the God Hand, basically, or an apostle, right? So they propagate. So it's important to note that they propagate. And what are apostles? Apostles are servants to the idea of evil, right? Which means the idea of evil propagates itself. And I think that's consistent with history, is that the evil begets evil, right?
Yeah.
Now, the red Beherit is different because it's not necessarily a distillation of the suffering of man. The red Beherit represents the idea of tyranny over the suffering of man. That which takes advantage of the suffering of man. It transcends evil because it's not only the suffering of man and let's say, because normal apostles that accept the gray or green Beherit, right? They are bargaining for mortality by sacrificing their soul, right? Whereas the red Beherit is sacrificing others' souls for the benefit of your own, which is even more evil than the regular Beherit, let's say.
Right, the Beherit, which is like the sacrifice of the self
In what does
in
that,
the service of evil.
and what does that
good.
is tyranny. The spirit of tyranny is what possesses the red Beherit.
Mm-hmm.
And so when
it's the transpersonal, right?
Right, and you have the God Hand, which is the idea of evil, and you have the 5 roots of it. And there's a reason why there are 5 roots of it here.
Yeah, I mean, think of the inverted pentagram, right? Which has 5 points.
Well, let's talk about what the God Hand, who comprises the God Hand. You have Ubik, Slan. I don't know the fat one's name. I forgot his name.
I don't know. But then we have Void.
Buddha Man. I'm going to call him Buddha Man.
Mr. Buddha.
Mr. Buddha. Then you have Void, and you have Femto.
Thumb.
Femto.
Who, at this point in time, is Femto.
Right. And that's what I want to get to. Because they all at some point had a red Beherit, which is a distillation of the spirit of tyranny instead of the spirit of suffering. That's one level further abstracted to evil.
Well, I say the thumb, but looking at this image, it's actually the pointer finger that is empty at the time of Femto becoming who he is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that means anything, but I just noticed that.
Interesting to note. So let's quickly talk about it. I mean, you have, obviously, with Buddha Man, you have gluttony, possibly avarice, embodied. Whereas in Void, and actually, I mean, Femto's center stage in that, so I don't think we can count him on one of the fingers exactly. But I would say femto is that that spirit of resentment, and I think he shares that with Void. And I think
Well, here's the thing.
it's not necessarily 5 distinct different shades of evil or flavors of evil per se. I think that the God hand springing up from the idea of evil, kind of each of them embody all 3 of the, let's say, the unholy trinity idea that perhaps Peterson originated, but that we've been talking about.
That's what I was going to say too, is it's like he embodies 2 of them, right? He embodies arrogance and he embodies resentment, right? And just by embodying those 2, it brings up the idea of evil to complete the trinity of arrogance.
You don't think, I mean, something Peterson talks about, Dr. Peterson, is that the deceit is the idea that he'll get away with it, that he'll get away with the lie that this is the correct path. Because I mean, think about this.
Well, the deceit is also the betrayal, right?
Well, do you think, Brock, do you think that Griffith acknowledges that this is the wrong path? Do you think Griffith, knowing Griffith, and I mean, I kind of want to fast forward here. Hold on.
No, just go to it.
I'm going to go to it. It's going to fucking
all
upset
these spoilers.
Me. Do you think that Griffith... Yeah, look at it. Look at it.
This is the deceit. This is the deceit.
So, does he embody all 3?
He embodies all 3, which summons that downward triangle that I mentioned in the picture.
That's what I mean. That's exactly what I mean. It's not just 2. You were trying to say that he only embodies 2, and it's not true.
Well, he embodies 2, and then whenever he has the opportunity to embody the 3rd, it's represented as the eclipse of the sun. Right?
Oh no, I would say the arrogance and deceit precede the resentment. The resentment comes when he says the words, I sacrifice.
I sacrifice, yeah.
That'll teach God to treat me this way.
But that's the thing, right? It is the hand coming up from the bottom. It is the will of the negative mythological spirit reaching up that he stands upon. And so that God hand it's called the God hand, but it's the will of a negative God for Griffith. And that, I mean, you can see it imagistically right there, and that the guiding thing, the guiding manifestation is void, which is a brain.
Well, let's talk about
embodied, right?
Let's talk about that. Why is Void the leader of the God Hand?
I think it's the intellect. It's tied to that ego. You could say that the growth of our brains is the cause of our downfall from
Let's start with this. Who's Prometheus?
He carried the flame of knowledge, right?
To
man.
And what happened to him? He was punished by Zeus to be chained to a rock and his liver pecked out every day by an eagle, and only to regenerate so his pain would be renewed each day. Sounds torturous.
Mm-hmm.
Void, was he tortured?
Well, look at his fucking face.
Well, let's get on with the next comparison. Who's Lucifer?
Lucifer is the light bringer.
What is light? What does that mean, light bringer?
He who brings the knowledge of the gods to man.
The enlightener, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a
or
big brain?
or
a
the
s-
brain,
Is that a
the
big brain or a
intellect,
small brain?
or self-knowledge, or
Right.
the ego?
What Miura is saying here in so many words, and by that I mean no words, and in fact a million words, because a picture is worth a fucking million words.
A billion.
A billion, a trillion.
Quadrillion.
Is that the paramount evil, that which leads evil, is the arrogance of rationality and the idea that rationality supersedes all that exists. The enlightening of man is the utmost importance, and the spirituality be damned. Right?
And
That spirit that opposes God based on the idea that it thinks it's better than God and more complete, as in rationality. That is the progenitor and evolution of evil. And that's what void is.
And we see that in what he does during the eclipse, right? And also shown in the next slide, which is that by denigrating the spirit of the feminine, it gouges out one of the eyes of Griffith, and
Griffith.
I mean of fucking A. I've already
Of guts.
been drinking so much.
Of guts. It's fine.
Yeah.
Continue. We're on a roll.
It gouges out one of Guts' eyes. It's one half of the spirit of the hero, right? It denigrates the feminine so much because it puts the intellect above the hierarchy itself, and it destroys the sight of the hero in the same way that you can say that well, you can see it in Egyptian mythology, right? With the eye of Horus.
I mean, I would
loss
say
of an eye as well.
Okay, so let's say void is that rationality, that intellect manifestation, but it's not he that decides to do the act. Who is it?
It is the pus of man. It is the evil in the heart of man.
Femto, yes.
It's Lucifer.
Is Femto Lucifer?
No, Femto is the Antichrist. He goes beyond Lucifer, right?
Yeah.
I believe
Lucifer,
that he's an
I would say
anti-Christian
Lucifer
figure.
is more void.
Yes. Femto is the knowledge of that and the acceptance of it anyway.
Yes. And so
he's the Antichrist. And that's why I say there's an inversion in Berserk. Right? You can see the inversion with Guts' origins as an orphan, where he is he's not the child of a holy virgin, but rather an unholy mother figure, right? The negative mother figure, the death mother figure, right? And so he's an inversion of the hero.
Well, I think. Hold on. Let me back up there, because I want to say, the culture of war and destruction and death is really what breeds Guts, because that's what breeds the hero. A hero arises when that
the necessity for the hero breeds the
exactly.
hero. Right.
I want to address that because we haven't mentioned that as far as his origins.
Well, we sort of mentioned it in saying that the respect for it is manifest in recognizing the lack of it, right? The respect for the father is the recognition within not having it in and of itself, right? And you can see the wisdom of it shows up archetypally with the loss of the father, right? With the death of the father, but also with the lack of the father. And that's sort of that orphan archetype. So we see the inverted orphan archetype, and that inversion is what I mean. That there's all of these inversions all throughout Berserk, and the whole fucking story is to make the point that the struggling is worth it, despite the fact that we're in that anti-Christian era, that there is an anti-Christian figure like Griffith that is leading the culture at times, that we need to be like Guts. You know, I know that I'm saying like a whole fucking lot, but
I mean,
but generally,
I mean,
that's the spirit of the thing.
we can't get into. we'll get into that. But I do want to mention here the loss of sight of the hero. We mentioned that earlier. Horus loses an eye. And sight
in his
is
encounter
awareness.
with Set, right?
Yes, in his encounter with Set. And this is his encounter with Set. That at the spirit of the adversary, the spirit of resentment, which I think Griffith most embodies, where the spirit of, let's say, pathological rationality, which I don't think we have a word for in English quite yet, but I want to say it's the French Revolution.
Well, also what I want to say about this is postmodern, right? Because this is the very beginning of the story, and what happens as a result of this is the seating of Griffith onto the throne, right? He becomes like he sits on the throne of the world and determines the nature of the world after this. And this is the very beginning. This is like the first 60 or 70 chapters of a 350 chapter manga, right? This is just the intro. And so we're setting up the inversion by putting Griffith on the throne and then determining the nature of the world itself.
But putting Guts' eye out is significant because it is that sacrifice he makes to persist on after experiencing true malevolence, which he undoubtedly and Casca experienced true malevolence, and they have their reactions to it. Guts loses an eye. Casca loses all senses, basically.
Yeah, because we see this idea that, it's not necessarily anti-feminist, but it's this idea that, like, Casca is the nourishing aspect within Guts. She is that which redeems Guts, and
it's
he
not
loses
just Guts.
it.
It's not just Guts. She's that which she is the positive feminine embodied. And what Griffith does when he what Femto does. Yeah, I need to delineate. What Femto does here is he destroys the idea of the ideal feminine.
Yeah, he erases it as a cultural manifestation. And as a result of that, puts the positive masculine on a path of, it's almost a zero-sum path rather than a positive path.
Well, what
gets rid of this option for him.
And what I mean too is, it prevents awareness of the hero by destroying, because females give males the ability to perceive. They give insight. For lack of a better term.
No, I mean, insight's a great way, but it's also the mirror by which the male sees himself as a status, right?
Right, and what Femto does here is he takes away that insight from Guts. And actually Guts goes through a very bad spiral after this because of that lack of insight.
Well, it's...
Because females are that which awaken, and it's because they awaken the self-consciousness of man. And so here, it's the destruction of that self-conscious, or let's say, the spirit which brings self-consciousness to man, that Guts really suffers from, and Casca is robbed of her identity of, because Casca, being a strong woman, is that which brings forth the best of man.
Well, it's so important for Guts, because the reason that I wanted to talk about the scene originally that I talked about in Guts and Casca coming together and revealing their vulnerabilities to each other is that this is a redemptive thing for Guts. This is what makes Guts whole. This is what can elevate Guts in the positive way. And we see the inversion here in Griffith's success in denigrating that.
You say this? Let's be more specific. What do you mean by this?
Remind me which this I said.
You said that this would further Guts' character.
Okay, well,
you were talking about Casca and them sharing their vulnerabilities.
Okay, so Casca and Guts come together. They share their vulnerabilities with each other, and by doing so, Casca becomes sort of this conduit for the wholeness for Guts. He sees the redemption in himself, right? And
why?
The reason that, yeah, sure. the reason that he sees that redemption in himself is that it's shown really well visually by he lashes out at her, and she asks him why, and he confesses that he killed his father figure, right? And that he has lost this positive masculine. And she
So
says,
hold on, stop there. Let's pause. Why would killing your father figure lead you to strike out against the I don't want to say ideal, but the let's say archetypal feminine? No, even more, the assertive feminine.
well, to kill the father is to kill a certain masculine element of yourself. So to look at Casca as the assertive feminine, the what she represents for him to fight back against her and to come at her with aggression is a reflection of his response to the idea of his father, which betrayed him.
You're close. Okay, so
I'm just thinking out loud right now.
Let me try and let me see if I can make my point. The father is what to someone, actually anyone, really, when we're talking about formulating ideals, right? Formulating values, the God becomes what?
The father.
Okay, yes.
God the Father.
And thus, God the Father and the judge.
Right, well, that which judges you.
That which judges.
Yeah.
Okay, so Guts lashes out, kills that judge of himself.
Which is the conscience.
Yes. And then what does the, let's say, I don't want to say assertive. It's a bad word for it. I'm trying to figure out the exact word for Casca.
Well, you can think of the feminine as a safeguard. That which judges you exterior to you.
Right, they're both. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's why Guts lashes out, is because he's in a moment of vulnerability.
And he wants to lash out at the judge of himself because he sees it in her.
Where he can be judged.
Yeah.
Right. And the feminine is what judges especially vulnerable young men, because it's beauty. Whereas the older father figure, Gambino, let's say, is not beauty that judges, but it's experience which judges. And you have these two inherent hierarchies of beauty and tradition, experience, however you want to say it, right? Both of which judge, and both of which Guts has to lash out against, because that judgment is against his survival in the beginning. And what that means is that the judgment of the hero prematurely diminishes and can extinguish the prospect of that hero coming to full potential. The tyranny of the father can be so great that it can extinguish the propensity of the hero to redeem. And that's what Guts lashes out against when he chokes Casca.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. It's about integration, right? It's about self-integration and the frailty of the human soul to lash out against that integration. And so we see that in Guts because, it's the inversion. Like, this is a very negative representation of the human spirit. And I mean, especially you think about, okay, you take that idea, and then you take the idea we've talked about with Griffith, right?
Well, hold on. Let's go back to where we were. The sharing of vulnerabilities and the acceptance of those vulnerabilities against the non-acceptance that he gets from Gambino allows him, and that's exactly what a partner can do for you, is accept your vulnerabilities and allow you to transcend them, which is what Guts is able to do. I mean, he chokes Casca, and then they come to terms, and he's able to work through his problems at that point.
Yeah, I mean,
Meaning,
it's not dissimilar to the end of Evangelion, you know, where Shinji is choking Asuka whenever he individuates, and it's very misunderstood. A lot of people look at that scene and they're like, it's like just nonsense at the end of Evangelion, but you know,
I never thought it was nonsense. I just think it's a poor articulation.
it's not as good as, you know, Dark Souls. It's not as good as Berserk.
It's just a okay. Yeah, it's just a poor art. I would say Evangelion is just a poor articulation of ideas that are profound, and there are some bits of good. I'll agree.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the angels, and it's more.
Oh, you know I love those angels.
Well, I mean,
don't get me started
the
on
angels
those.
are more articulated, let's say, than the apostles in Dark Souls, right? Like, imagine if there were as many apostles in Dark Souls as there were angels in Evangelion, and they represented the same things for Guts as they did for Shinji in Evangelion, right? So there's a cultural significance to Evangelion that we're not even getting in Berserk, but that's because Berserk is more archetypal.
Okay, sure, I'll agree. To in order to move on and
yeah, not to derail it, but you know what I'm saying. Right?
I just want to move back to what we were saying, right? What I meant was, so the tyranny of the father can be so severe that it can,
right. I mean, the tyranny of the father, right? The only reason that I mentioned that is because you think
snuff out, right? The
Gendo,
judgment
right?
specifically,
yeah,
can snuff out the spirit of the hero, but the judgment of the feminine does not do that. It actually nourishes the hero, and that's pretty much what we see. And then we see this, which is a perversion, a debasement of the idea of the feminine redeeming the spirit of the hero.
Yeah, well, we see that Guts
and the
comes
fact
to terms
the
with
fact
that
that,
nourishing element,
I mean,
and then it's denigrated.
It's not only that, but it's fuck. I don't even want to say. It's that, and people have argued this, and I'm not saying it's definitely rape. I'm not saying it's not rape, but Casca does seem to derive some physical pleasure from it. It makes it worse.
Yeah.
Because it is a debasement. It's like it is bringing the ideal feminine down to a biological and base level. And it's
a reduction.
It achieves.
Yeah.
Femto's victory is just so complete by doing this.
Well, what he does is he debases the logos, right? What he does is so against the logos because he brings the Eros down to a biological level, and this is the inversion. You know, we keep talking. I mean, I keep talking about inversion, but like, this is the thing. This is against the logos, and it's so. I mean, that's the tragedy of it. You know, there's something extremely tragic about that. The depiction so far of what Griffith is he's like, it's the band of the hawk. It's the band. You think of the hawk as the logos. You think of the hawk as the elevated sight. And then the inversion shows up through Femto, where he's the shadow of the hawk of light. He's the hawk of darkness. And this happens and creates a manifestation of the shadow, right? So that's the tragedy. And I mean, really, we're still fucking grappling with that tragedy, right? There's no resolution to this. I mean, there's some resolution, but not like what we're talking about right now. This is the foundation, right? The foundation is not fucking resolved. Like, we're still in the inversion.
Right, and the logos is permanently damaged. His sight is permanently damaged by the debasing of the feminine. Meaning, if malevolence is allowed to debase the spirit of the feminine in society, the propensity for the hero to emerge is further damaged. Berserk is almost a guide for someone to become the Antichrist.
Yeah, I mean, it's to say, like,
first, you subscribe to ambition, first and foremost. Arrogance. It's a path, and it leads to this. the resentment of existence itself, and the debasing of the spirit of the feminine, the positive feminine.
Right. And we see before this
And you
scene
can, and that's the thing.
in
If one was possessed by such a spirit, which I actually do not think any historical person, not Hitler, not Stalin, not Mao, has been so possessed as Griffith is in this story.
well, I talk about this as an inversion, right? It starts with the debasement of the sociological interpretation of the feminine, and then takes it down to the personal level of the feminine. And it is like, how would I say? It debases Gus's ability to connect with the feminine, right? That's the gouging out of the eye. The result is that through the debasement of what Costco represents for the proper way of being. And so it's sort of this, that's the real tragedy of Berserk, right? I mean, that Femto manages to represent this debasement of that idea on a transpersonal and personal level.
Yeah.
It's wholly negative. It's like
It's unholy.
it's unholy, right?
That's precisely it. And it's the malevolence that drives him to do it, and that's the point. And so the product of that coupling is this creature,
The Moonlight Child.
the Moonlight Child.
And I want to point out that little picture there is the final panel of Berserk. The setup at the last episode is that we were going to, I took it to mean that we were going to go into the definition of the Moonlight Child, because he shows up at the end of the last chapter.
And here in the picture behind it, it seems that Gus is being pursued by the child.
This is very early into the series. I mean, this is within like the first, like,
Just after Golden Age.
this is very early on.
Before Golden Age?
I think this is before Golden Age.
That's right.
This is while he's locked up in the first like 5 issues. And so this idea was written into the very beginning of the manga. I mean, this is from the very beginning.
And obviously, I mean, if you've been paying attention to what we've been saying, you perhaps have puzzled this out. But this is the pursuit of, let's say, the fruit of your loins that comes after you've sown those seeds. It's the activity has consequence. And specifically here, when it's been absolutely corrupted by Femto and has become the Moonlit Child. And what does that mean? What does that mean? Let's get to that. So, Casca's pregnant, obviously, when the eclipse happens.
Well, she's pregnant from the eclipse.
She has the baby shortly after the eclipse. She was already pregnant. She had to be.
Okay. All right. So following this, what you're saying, right? Because I hadn't really considered it that way, but the idea.
Guts.
Well, the idea being
this
that
is
there's
Guts' child. Obviously, this is Guts' child.
Okay, so let's say the coupling of the archetypal feminine and masculine creates something which is then tainted by what Femto is, right?
Well, let's be specific.
Specifically
let's be
saying-
as specific and as precise as we can. Go ahead.
Femto as an emissary of the idea of evil, right? Femto as the manifestation of that as a force on the, how do I want to say, the nature of existence itself, because there's Well, you think of the Moonlight Child. What's the Moonlight Child? It's the child of that happening, right?
Well, the Moonlight Child is the coupling of the masculine and the feminine that is integrated with the unholy.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's moonlit to begin with. It's not the sunlight child. That would be a normal child,
Yeah.
right?
This is the inversion of that.
Of course. And so the moonlight child is just that. And I think too, specifically, it's Femto that creates the perversion because he is the spirit of malevolence against the idea that they represent. Femto embodying arrogance, deceit, and resentment has allowed him to not believe in true, and this is evident in some of in the speech specifically that he gives to Charlotte. Sorry, Charlotte, Princess Charlotte.
Yeah.
He doesn't see other people as equal to him.
Right. Well, this is what he says on the night after Guts murders a child in his name, right?
They're just pawns to him.
He enacts his will on the world, and
to be his equal, you must also enact your will on the world.
But by doing so, it results in the loss of the child of the life of an innocent, right?
Yes, but what I'm getting to here is his involvement with the corruption of their child.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the archetypal masculine, right? The Logos. And you have Casca, the archetypal feminine, and
the Eros.
Yes. And so you have the coupling of that is intermingled with the corruption of the unholy, being Femto.
Right, the anti-Logos.
And what that means is that the child is born with the propensity for evil, which is exactly what happens in mythological stories. Adam and Eve, no, but Cain and Abel, yes, the propensity of evil.
Right, the relationship between Cain and Abel being that there is a resentment towards being itself that is enacted with the murdering.
But it is representative that it's, let's say, duplicated and multiplied throughout time, meaning that children, right, have that perception. Children born from innocent parents, or let's say forthright and righteous parents, have the propensity of evil within them. And Guts and Casca are, well, we'll never see them resolve it, but that was their next path, was to resolve and square and overcome, let's say, the faults of Aurora's parents in Sleeping Beauty, to not shelter their child from the idea of evil, but to embrace it a little at a time, to bolster and, let's say, in Jordan Peterson's words, buttress your child for the hardships of life.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's look at the origin of Casca's story, right? Which is that she was being sold off to a wealthy man, and she was going to be raped, and then Griffith steps in and saves her from that, and she owes her chastity to Griffith, right? And as cruel as it sounds, that is a representation of the stepping in to stop the feminine from being aware of the aspect of evil, to intercede. And so, you see this fallout of that, and the lack of integration of that ever happening now with Berserk. But I mean, it's sort of like then, but that's kind of what I meant whenever I said that Casca was this nourishing element for the hero, and that's lost through the negative aspect of Femto. It's like it's not available to Guts after that. And after that, Casca is
Right.
not
It's
herself.
not available because the idea has been perverted by Femto.
Right. It's been denigrated, you know.
And that's the thing. Denigrating women to sexual objects, which is, not to bring too much politics into it, but it's what some theorists espouse when they mention that the societal gaze views women as objects. The debasing of them as such is so unholy that it can rob the spirit of the hero of his nourishment to proceed forward in a righteous way.
Yeah, I mean, you can consider it as third and fourth wave feminism, right? Which is it's the freedom, but also the denigration of the feminine form as something to be respected and held as.
Well, I mean, traditionally, feminine form is actually denigrated by those two waves of feminism.
Yeah, I mean, it's an ironic, imbalanced, or you could say inverted.
More or less, though, it's the what am I trying to say? It's the degradation of the ideas of femininity, virtue, and I was going to say one more. I suppose chastity.
Well, you mentioned virtue, which definitely takes me into my understanding of the next panel, which is
okay, so let's say first, why do you think I'm saying it's a denigration of virtue? Why is it that you think, or why do you think, this is going to be a weird question, why do you think I think that Femto is denigrating virtue with what he does to Casca?
He's showing that by virtue of power, he has a claim over the archetypal feminine.
Does Casca, and this is going to be the hardest question, I mean, we're two males talking about this. Does Casca enjoy it? It's a hard question.
At the end, yes. And that's a really difficult thing to talk about. So, not at first, right? There's actually a lot of panels of Casca.
A lot, yeah. We
just
couldn't
not
show them here.
Yeah. It's a lot of her not being happy, not enjoying it. Like it's not originally like, and as soon as he forces himself on her, then she just enjoys it.
She's ravished. No, it's not Dracula.
It's not like that. She's not enjoying it. And there's this moment where she turns to Guts and she says, "Don't look." And he doesn't listen. He continues to look. And what he witnesses is this. It is a dissolution, I think that's the word to use, of the feminine identity before his eyes. And the only way that I can describe this is by thinking of, like, if you gaze into the void gazes back into you. It's this sort of, he's seeing a negative element of the dominance hierarchy and accepting it as a nature of existence.
I mean, remember what Slan says here. She says it's the culmination of human experience, pain, suffering, joy, pleasure.
She's just enticed by the experience.
Because it is, and because Casca is experiencing joy because of the physical, and that's the thing. Femto is showing that free will and the logos is powerless compared to the biological hardwiring and the destiny that we're all set out for.
It's laying that low in a weird way, right?
Not in a weird way, in a fucking powerful way.
Yeah, I mean, well, in a way that I say weird because without understanding why, it's sort of like, oh, it's just dark.
Without realizing the spirits in which these characters are embodying, it is hard to tell. I agree. But once you figure it out, it's obvious that's what's happening. And the spirit of Femto is that which debases, that which is resentful, and therefore opposed, the
anti-Christian manifestation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's why the child is the Moonlight Child, right?
Yeah, exactly. And let's get back to that. So, in the Moonlight Child being the manifestation of Guts and Casca's child integrated with malevolence, haunts Guts. And that's the thing here. It's haunting Guts now because it's... Are you sure this is before? I think this is after the Golden Age. Look, he doesn't have his mechanical arm.
It is both. This is in the first few chapters, which takes place after the Golden Age.
Well, hold on. But he doesn't have his mechanical arm. We don't see that until after the Golden Age. I'm pretty sure. Possibly.
It's hard to remember.
Anyways, point is, the idea that his child could be malevolent. This is the, let's say this picture behind. I don't want to say the picture in the bottom left, but the picture behind that is the idea that made. Hold on.
Remember.
Is the idea that made Kronos eat his children.
Yes. Now, what I remember about this is, if you recall from the first few chapters of Berserk, he fights against the he fights against the Count and is overwhelmed eventually. What happens is the first torture scene in Berserk, which is Guts being strung up and he loses his mechanical arm. And this is before we even know why he has one, right? And then he escapes. And during the escape sequence, he's running through, it's like sewers underneath where he's been captured. And he hallucinates during that time. And then he has this hallucination of this, well, we don't really know what it is at the time because it's so early in the story, but this deformed fetus watching over him and making him paranoid. And, you know, he makes some very poignant statements about the situation he's in. You know, he's just like, oh, you know, I'm not defined by you, is essentially the theme of what's happening here. But that's shown from the very beginning.
That's not true.
Yeah.
Children are a double-edged sword. They can either redeem you or damn you.
Well, I mean...
And the prospect of damnation is what haunts Guts here. And the reason Kronos eats his children is because they have the propensity to... And this is what is said in the Greek myth, is that Kronos was told that he would be overthrown by his children, so he eats them, right? The propensity for the children to either redeem you or destroy you.
Yeah, I mean, he's haunted by the negative aspect, right?
I mean, he's not... He doesn't look like the bottom left in this picture.
No, but...
He's definitely deformed. But this is the same character. If anyone's watching and doesn't know, the thing in the middle of the screen and the boy in the bottom left-hand corner are the same character.
They are the moon child, moon presence, you could even say, as this idea, I think, inspired part of what the moon presence is, even in Bloodborne.
Well, sure, but I think it's moon related because of femto.
Yes. It is the negative aspect within the moon. It is if you could split life and death, or you could say ego and unconscious, or you could say knowledge versus wisdom. All of these dichotomies, the negative or the black half of the yin yang, right? It's that's what this is, and this is what he's haunted by. It's the negative aspect of life itself, the life that he could be bringing into the world, right? Because let's imagine that the eclipse never happens, and it's like, okay, the meta story is that he meets back up with Casca, they pair up, they have a child, and because of that, he never sees any of these people again. He has to sacrifice the idea of the Band of the Hawk, and so as a consequence, they are a sacrifice that he has to make internally as part of his identity, because his identity doesn't support this whole other group of people. It only becomes the family unit. So you could say psychologically he has to sacrifice them as an idea, as part of his identity. So that sacrifice, right? That's part of it, I think. But this is this negative manifestation in Griffith. But I mean, I haven't really gotten past that point. I'm curious what you think of that, because it's really tied into the archetypal nature of it.
Right, and I think it was. So I'm trying to get to that earlier. So the Moonlight Child is the coupling of Guts and Casca, which are both positive spirits, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Corrupted by femto.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is happening here, and like I was saying about Kronos, is the propensity for children to either destroy or redeem their parents is evident here. But I actually think it's poignant that you chose this other picture, because that's the redemption. That's the beautiful child.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have the monstrous child here that's haunting Guts. And as you said, you looked it up, I assume. This is before the Golden Age.
Yeah, and this is much, much, much later. This is like the beginning and end.
But also, no, I mean, the child doesn't appear until after the egg arc and all that. So, I mean, we would have to... We're going to do a whole analysis of Berserk. So please stay tuned. Because we'll be able to talk about more about the Moonlight Child. But as far as what you're saying, I think that tersely, let's sum it up, that Guts is apprehensive about the propensity of bringing his own destruction into the world through the vehicle of the Moonlight Child, specifically because Griffith has had a hand in corrupting it.
Yeah, and Griffith being sort of an emissary of the idea of evil. So it's kind of like the fall from the archetypal wisdom of being, right? And is it worth it to bring life into a world that...
It is saying that, like, instilling the idea of evil within a creature will... And Guts is afraid of that, will instinctively cause that creature to rebel against its father. And that's true. Because if you think about the spirit of the father and the authority, the idea which goes against, if it inhabits that child, will obviously first go against the authority it encounters, which is the father, always.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe not always.
Well, yeah, as the
spirit of
progenitor of the concept of authority, yeah.
Right, and that's what's happening here. And Guts is grappling with that, and I think... it is a more detailed and it's a more nuanced dealing with the idea of procreation rather than, let's say, another series that we like, Dragon Ball, which goes into those ideas briefly, but I think Berserk really explores them further and better. But let's continue because we have way more slides to get through. So let's talk about how the Skull Knight is here with his blue Beherit sword.
So this is the origination of Get the Mic almost, because we had talked about the door too.
I mean, that was the door. I think the door is the first one that we're like, all right, because we talked like 90 minutes about a door.
We talked about two different things. We talked about the door, and we talked about how the Skull Knight is a social justice warrior.
We also talked about that. It's true. Not to bury the lead. I don't want to give anything too big away because we're gonna make a video about it. But
there's a significant element of like, if you understand what the Bayolet is,
Beherit, yep,
for
wielding
Griffith,
the suffering,
and for the Skull Knight as the manifestation of King Geyserich, right?
And that's another thing I kind of
king.
Man, see that's what I kind of want to get into doing individual episodes after Dragon Ball.
It's very complex, but to just point it out, like, he is the manifestation of that and consumes them to create a sword, and through trying to use that sword on Femto creates pandemonium. That is an extremely complicated idea that I would say is about 50% of our idea to even do this in the first place.
Not idea, but catalyst, I would agree. Yeah.
I mean, that conversation was a big part of it, because we had this strange realization about when you understand culturally what Berserk is representing and then what this action represents, it's like, oh, wow. Miura was really tapped into this cultural zeitgeist and had things to say about it. And I think those things are significant, I think that he was tapped into some archetypal truths that anybody could take away from the story if they understand it properly.
That's the power of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whoa. What am I seeing?
This is the shadow. This is sort of the unbridled shadow within Guts. He's introduced to the idea of the Beast of Darkness, and then later on integrates the Beast of Darkness through his armor, which damages him but also makes him stronger, which is very similar to an idea we have in Dragon Ball as well, right? With Saiyans being stronger after they're broken.
Well, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it has to do with this sort of integration of the shadow or a manifestation of the shadow. So Guts has a physical manifestation of the shadow, and it consumes him, and he abuses Casca at the hands of this shadow originally when he comes into contact with it. He integrates it quickly and puts it under control because he's a fucking Chad. He's a fucking hero. So he treats Casca poorly once, understands what the shadow is doing to him, integrates it properly.
He doesn't bite off her head.
He just thinks about it.
Oh, he bites her breast.
Yeah, he just bites the titty. No, he is overcome with the spirit of the Beast of Darkness originally, but he figures out how to integrate it, and these ideas of ego and shadow are relevant to all serious mythological stories. It's relevant to Dragon Ball. It's relevant to Greek mythology. It's relevant to Berserk.
Sometimes the shadow is disembodied. Sometimes it's internal. Sometimes it's could be
an external force upon the internal cosmos.
Right. It could be a lot of manifestations, but it's usually there. And this is make everything food for your malice. And that is the path down which you achieve the unholy.
It's to say that, like, you should consume the things that you think that you deserve because of the nature of what you've wrought with your resentment.
Well, it's, I mean, in my interpretation, it is saying that you use things to fuel your own hatred of the world.
Of being.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Of being.
Yeah.
Oh, tree, here it is.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to have to just move right through this one pretty quickly because
this is going to be a whole episode.
Yeah. No, this one frame is probably an hour-long conversation. But
so, the great tree, here it is.
This is
Yggdrasil.
This is the
Yggdrasil.
This is what I want to call this the roots of the inverted great tree.
Created by
this same inversion that we've been talking about.
So, well, let's quickly cover Ganishka here. So, Ganishka is a character who was an apostle. He wasn't as powerful as Griffith, so he got salty. Made his own egg of the king, because he had a regular Beherit. Who's like, I'm going to become as powerful as a god hand.
Mm-hmm.
And used hundreds of apostles to make a new Beherit for his own use. He became this giant tree thing. But he was so powerful he lost sense of self. So let's just cover that. We have to get that's a lot.
Well, the manifestation of this thing that we see also is
define apostle.
Well, it's because of what happened 2 frames before with the wielding of the Beherit sword. But to understand now, we have to talk about
hold on.
apostle.
That's the tree. I'm just talking about how Ganishka even becomes tree.
Yeah, which is
apostle. So define apostle.
An apostle is this mode of being that is prostrate to I don't want to just call it the God hand because that's not specific enough, but prostrate to this idea of the sacrifice of that which is external to the self because of the fall of goodness through the postmodern lens.
No, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the postmodern lens. I would just say apostle is someone who serves the spirit of tyranny, who sold their soul for the spirit of tyranny, or let's say to the spirit of tyranny.
Okay.
Now, why, and it's specific too, that Ganishka has collected apostles who have sold their spirits, right, to form his own Beherit, his own form of tyranny. Now, once you've distilled it that much, and once he's had all these apostles sacrifice themselves, who've all lost their souls anyways, to become their own vessel, let's say, for Ganishka. Ganishka is so far gone from humanity that he is unable to recognize himself. And that's actually what causes his downfall, because he's not even able to defend himself against Griffith and the others. He's not even aware they're there.
Right.
As a great band once said, the eyes of man look on and beyond. It is when you, let's say, when you sacrifice even those who've already sacrificed to gain insight, it gives you it inherently has a blind spot, which is the lack of self. And the more, and I think that's actually true generally, the more that you are able to sacrifice the souls of others, the less you are capable of perceiving your own humanity. I think a lot of soldiers would agree with me on that.
Yeah, well, it is placing the self outside of the place that it belongs within the hierarchy. It's elevating the self above the other, placing the sacrifice of the other as a justifiable decision for the self. And so we also see that this is manifested through. I just want to briefly say and not even get into what it means whenever I say that Skull Knight eats those Beharets, forms them into a sword, and tries to strike down Femto. When he does that, he creates the space for this to manifest itself. And whenever I look at it, it's sort of an inverted Teldrassil or world tree, right? Its roots going up into the sky, coming up from below. Portrayed as light, which is a parallel of what Femto is, right? Because he's the Hawk of Light, but really he's the Hawk of Darkness because he's Femto. So he's a negative manifestation. So there's this correlation between the two, and how Skull Knight wielding something forged from that, which I'm not even going to go into, but what the Beharit or the Behelit represents, by him using that for this, he creates that thing.
Right, and it is. I think we'll talk more about this when we go into our series. But let's continue. That is not a slide we want to talk about. I really want to mention this from the movies, which is actually the first thing I watched when Brock got me into Berserk. He gave me the movies because I was like, I don't like anime. I don't want to watch no anime. So he's like, all right, watch these movies because it's not as long as the anime.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this scene is just iconic, and it is the will of the individual against the spirit of the subjugated, let's say. It's really Guts versus himself. Guts, it's really if Guts wants to leave. He's powerful enough to leave. He can decide.
Well, we're at the point now where we see how Griffith is dressed, right? He's in the finements of the Royal Society. And I think this really has to do with the individual versus society's interpretation of the individual. And this is Guts saying, no, this is truly the spirit of the individual, the spirit of self-betterment, regardless.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing. Once Guts has determined that that's what he's going to do, there's nothing that could stop him. Before, the first time that Guts and Griffith fought, would you say Guts had a path? Or was he aimless?
Absolutely aimless. He had no path.
That's
but Griffith had a path.
A path empowers you. And it allows you to break away from a path that another might have set forth, which is exactly what happens here. And it's so the spirit of the individual versus the spirit, I don't want to say of tyranny, but the spirit of
the collective individual, or the position of the individual within the collective identity, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And this is to say that the true spirit of the individual is greater than that. It transcends it. And it lays Griffith so low that he has no identity, right?
Well, the problem is that, oh man, it's a lot to get into.
It's extremely complex. because
So if we're talking about that, so we're saying that the will of another and let's say some societal pressure is broken by the heroic individual, so much so that it ruins its own prospects of propagation. True. But I kind of want to leave it at that because otherwise we'll be here for 2 more hours. I only have
true.
like 15 more minutes. I'm getting tired. So, I wanted to mention this. This is one of the later chapters, a doll of Casca's, which is represented in the dream. It's one of my favorite symbolic pieces that Miura introduced later in the series. Spoiler alert if anyone hasn't noticed, but this is when Shirka and Farnese go into the dream and try and rescue Casca. And I think it's so great that it's a doll. Dolls are fragile, like the psyche of Casca at the time, and also repairable.
Yeah, I mean, not to force a meaning onto this, but at this point, Casca was used, right? She was used like a doll. She was made property of the spirit of Femto,
And to be
denigrated.
specific, the spirit of the antihero, that which goes against, that which debases, and that
Mm-hmm.
which subverts, right? Interacting with the spirit of the feminine obviously creates that relationship.
Right.
But go ahead.
And to say that like the spirit of Femto sees everything through a lens of power. So to interact with the archetypal feminine through the lens of power is to say that the feminine belongs to you, right? It's to denigrate the spirit of the feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very similar to, let's say, Neon Genesis Evangelion, where Asuka's, which sounds like Casca, Asuka's origin is that her mother confused her with a doll and treated her like she was a doll. And part of her identity is that she's a doll, and she has to reconcile that. And that's ultimately, as a part of her individuation, is that she breaks away from that as something that's crippling her. So this idea it's really deep. It's really rooted in this archetypal interpretation of individuation and empowerment.
And when that empowerment is robbed, let's say.
Yeah, and the reintegration of it,
Mm-hmm.
and how important it is, because we only see this through the lens of us trying to reintegrate Casca. They only find this out about Casca when they enter the realm of magic, and then they're like, oh, maybe we can repair Casca's
And
psyche.
man, that's a whole nother thing to talk about.
Yeah.
But I do really love the imagery used here and the symbology, just to touch on it. Next, we have an amazing panel, the eclipse. It's so good. I mean, not much to say other than Miura's penmanship will be sorely missed. He was a master, and I think this is one of his great panels.
The eclipse is just so. I mean, it's archetypically powerful for sure. I mean, even think about Avengers, right? And a major sacrifice that happens at the end of Infinity War, right? These sacrifices being tied to the imagery of the eclipse. I mean, I don't think that the writers of Avengers were thinking about Berserk, right? These ideas are commonalities of the sacrifice concept, and so
right.
Miura's,
But that sacrifice, those are comedies, so those sacrifices are for the greater good. This sacrifice is absolutely evil. And
absolutely,
you can see Casca right here.
But either way, the use of the sacrifice for the changing of the nature of the world, it and being represented as the eclipse of light by the moon, right? And what the moon represents on an archetypal level. It's a commonality you can see across a lot of media. So if you think about it, and then you think about, oh, where else have I seen an eclipse? The idea of the sun, the idea of the moon, the idea of the logos, you can kind of put those together, and you can see what we're talking about here is applicable to a lot of things that we're not talking about.
Don't have the time, boys.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, this with color is specifically what I'd seen in my dreams before I'd ever heard about Berserk. I was at my aunt's house and I fell asleep and I had some premonition about this specific image. It really, when I saw it, it was just like, just came back. And it's so hard to articulate. It's such a hard. I'm gonna have to think about it more.
Yeah, the eclipse is just so
It's just,
powerful.
it's not even when they go into the astral plane or hell or whatever. It's this in the water that looks like blood, with the bandages and broken hand and the mask, and the eclipse itself with holding up the Beharit. There's something about it, and I'm gonna get down to it. There's something really really deep.
There's so much about it. I mean, to be very brief about it, I could say, think about what the mask that is the Falcon means on the broken man. I mean,
That's what I
it's
mean.
just
So
there's a lot to it.
and I've already established the Beharit, the red Beharit specifically, is that which tyrannizes the others in order to achieve its means. Right? It's the one abstraction higher than the regular ones, and holding that up as your ideal causes the eclipse.
Mm-hmm.
It's
the identity with the victimhood. It's the identity with.
It's not. Well, it is. It's partially that. It's partially that, but it's also the resentment against the world for your position, and it is the utilization of others' malevolence to further your own malevolence. That is the level of abstraction that summons such a cataclysmic event, and I suppose I was probably 6 or 7. I'd just gotten back from Disneyland, something like that. But I was starting to understand evil in the world, and I had a dream like this, realizing that it's not just that which takes advantage of other people, which is evil, but that which takes advantage of the spirit, which takes advantage of people.
It's the shadow of what is good. It is the eclipse, right?
And that's exactly what Griffith becomes, because he adopts and he creates a kingdom that allows for spirits and modes of being which are antithetical to being to exist.
Well,
and prosper.
That's why I wanted to show the inverted tree in the.
And that actually is where Falconia is. So
yeah. It's a twisted, inverted tree of light.
It's also kind of looks like a double helix, but let's continue.
Yeah,
we got to get going. So one of my favorite moments right here. Oh yeah, and this is specifically because it is the adversary, and by not the spirit of the adversary. Let's say the spirit of persistence and determination when combined with strength. And there's some honorific aspects of Zod as well. And when you combine those, they make a force powerful enough to fight Ganishka at the time, which is like a lightning demon. I think he's a lightning demon at the time.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of archetypal thought when it comes to Ganishka, but
I do. It's just I can't get too much into it. I just want to mention some of our favorite stuff before we end, because we got to end pretty soon. We've been recording for 3 hours.
We got this image to feel sad.
Pretty sad.
I mean, it's you look at Guts.
That's the thing.
The
it's
shadow.
Not, I said earlier, I was like, Griffith will never receive justice, but he'll also never be redeemed.
I mean, this element of Griffith where he's a traitor. You know, he's not just negative. It's that he was a positive element that at a very crucial point turned towards negative. That he was an enlightening piece of the hero that turned. It's so much more tragic that way because it's personal. It's like the evil in the heart of man that needs to be reconciled and overcome, and we don't get the opportunity to do that.
But it's not overcome. It's succumb to, and it's just so upsetting to see what could have been, how Griffith could have acted instead of acting the way he did. But again, it's a sad thing because I mean, even Darth Vader was redeemed. Not to say that anyone can be redeemed, but I would have liked to see what Miura had in store for these two.
Yeah.
This picture has always caused me a lot of consternation ever since I saw the outcome of their relationship. And I think it's because it is that spirit of nostalgia that is inherent in humans for a reason. And that is because consistently things. No, I don't. I want to be more specific than that. It is because the how do I want to phrase this?
The way that I would put it is that this scene is in a prequel. First and foremost, that this is the setup for the fall that is the main story, the vast majority of the chapters of Berserk. And the Golden Age is the cosmogonic time prior to the separation of the light and darkness, and the existential dread that has come from the separation of the two. So, this picture is just like you can think of there was a time in human history where valor was a virtue, and there was no guilt, and there was no fall from.
Okay, so I think I've kind of collected what I was going to say, and it's to say that in this picture, it is a symbol of fraternity, right? It is a symbol of companionship, camaraderie, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is exactly the antithesis of what Griffith chooses later. And it's so sad because you can see that Griffith's spirit here is something that he could have persisted with, but by his actions chose not to. And it's a limitation because you see the exact outcome that could have been, and that is two men supporting each other in friendship, which is a beautiful thing.
Well, you think of Cain and Abel, right? And there is,
but there's no that's the thing. Before the first picture, the battle in the snow, there is no Cain and Abel.
There's just the integration, right?
Yeah.
And then the disintegration sort of comes with, well, you see how Guts leaves Griffith and how Griffith copes with that, right?
Well, and that's the thing. It is the fact that the spirit in which Griffith is inhabiting, which is that of ambition, cannot contend with an individual spirit outshining it. And that's exactly what happens.
Right, which proves to him that he's not operating in the spirit of what he claims to be.
Right, and that's what happens with Lucifer and God, right? Lucifer wants to overthrow God because he thinks he is the more bright soul, right?
Right, but ultimately he is just an emulation of the idea of God.
Right, and that's the exact thing here is that Guts shows him that there is a path in which one can be better for oneself, for the individual.
For the sake of betterment.
Right, and Griffith cannot stand that because it goes against that idea that his mode of being is the best way.
Inherently the best way.
Precisely. But he doesn't think that here, and it's really sad to see it because Griffith could have been.
I mean, the disintegration to the fall of man.
Yeah. Ishidoro, I wanted to mention Ishidoro. He is the not progenitor. Sorry, he's a successor to the Spirit of Guts, and I'm sad we're never gonna see the end of his story because he was great in the last few chapters, and you know it. He was amazing.
Ishidoro is Monkey Boy, right? I think in the last
but
chapters,
I mean,
he was swinging from branches.
He would have been swole. He would have been like Guts, man. He would have actually probably helped Guts overthrow the tyranny of Falcone if it came to that.
I think that he was a nascent
and for anyone that
reintegration of the masculine spirit.
I think for anyone that says like, oh well, Guts has no reason to go fight Griffith or anything like that. It's like, okay, I don't believe so because Guts has a moral obligation to do so. At this point, he has a moral obligation to unbind the tyranny which he helped create. Undoubtedly, Guts helped create Griffith. And so I don't hold too much merit in that fact. Now do I think they have to have a final battle or anything like that? Not necessarily. But Guts has to come to terms with his own involvement in the rise of Griffith. And he has to stop the tyranny of Falconia. But I again, that's never going to happen. I just think that's where the story should have gone.
Yeah, I mean, that was Miura's recognition of the idea that what he was dealing with and what he had dropped Guts into was an idea so big that he needed to even introduce another generation just to start working with the ideas. And that next generation, of course, was him.
And Ishidoro, too, he tries to lift Guts' sword here, and it's funny because it's a lot like the Thor scene. He's not able to lift it. His strength, his mode of being is not yet strong enough to be able to wield an astral hewing sword.
Right, or what we could call the Dragon Slayer.
Right, he's not powerful enough to slay dragons. Even with Guts asleep, he doesn't.
I mean, we're not even talking about that, but conceptually, that the sword that Guts.
But he's
wields
also
is
just
the
a kid.
Slayer.
He's also just a kid because later on we see him do some awesome stuff.
Yeah.
In those last chapters with the witches specifically, if you haven't read those, I highly recommend that you do because they're great.
Yeah, it's really a coming into himself that we get to see.
Yeah, and he's becoming mature. He's becoming a man, and it's so awesome to see. I've loved Ishidoro since the beginning. Some people think he's annoying. I think those people just don't understand or don't remember what it's like to be a kid.
Well, it's great because Isidoro is the inheritor of an idea that's extremely powerful,
Who values it and who subjugates and says, Guts, teach me your ways.
Yeah, from the very beginning.
Yep.
He basically humbles himself, and that humility is something that
is a first step in becoming better.
I think it's necessary for the audience to see to recognize that humility.
And so I think we have a couple more pictures. We have this one. I love this one. So why is it the moon?
I think that it has a lot to do with why the Uzeru comes out at the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tied into the shadow.
Right, and he's specifically in the Berserker armor here. So he's bestial. He's chaotic, right?
Right, and I think that the Berserker armor really ties into that shadow integration, right? The wearing of the Berserker armor is the acceptance of shadow integration. It's the mode of being by which you are integrating the shadow.
It can strengthen you.
but it damages you.
But it damages you,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think too, it's a specific instance that it is a very bright moon in this picture, to allow for that enlightenment to still exist. So you're still traveling along that path of light and dark. In fact, you're in the dark with the light dot, and dot being the moon. So I think that definitely is the case in this instance. And again, the moonlit child is just that too. It's in the darkness, and then that dot is the moon, like we said.
Yeah, and this is how you slay demons. This is how you destroy.
You must travel within that realm of light in the darkness.
It's to say that self-sacrifice is necessary to defeat the negative ideas that persist beyond generations.
Well, not just self-sacrifice, but the acceptance of pain,
Mm-hmm.
the acceptance of loss.
Inherited struggle.
Yes. Oh, this is the best. I
This is
love
one of the greatest panels, if not the greatest panel in all of Berserk.
Rickard is the man. See, there should be like huge balls down here between his legs.
This is the pimp slap heard round the world.
Oops. Oh yeah. And so Rickard, first encountering Griffith in Falconia, slaps him because he's on to his BS. He's like, oh well, the Band of Hawk, whatever. Forget about them. There's a new one. He's like, well, I'm not forgetting about them. Slap.
It's so brutal. This is the very first time, and this is after hundreds of chapters since the eclipse, that anybody other than Guts recognizes the truth about Griffith. And it's one of the most satisfying things I've ever seen in my life.
It's so great, and you can see the force of it.
Because this is the validation of it. That Guts has been struggling against this entire time. The unearned position. And also the denigration of the spirit of good. And he comes back and he says, oh yeah, no, Guts is right. The spirit of the masculine is right to fucking hate you. Because you are everything that's wrong with the interpretation
Duplicity,
of being.
Arrogance, resentment. Rickard can see right through it because Rickard's the man. He's grown up.
He doesn't need to be even integrated, and he doesn't need to be the hero.
Well, and why is that? Because Rickard has already assumed so much responsibility that he is embodying more holiness than the, let's say, what is it? I guess the charlatan-esque Griffith could ever muster.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this scene, because Griffith he's being a charlatan to the people.
Yeah.
And
he's using his hellish powers to summon spirits of the dead and impress the masses by reuniting them with their loved ones, when really it's an unholy thing to do.
This is a negative representation of his appealing to their ancestry, which is to say, you all are victims.
Yeah.
I'm using your ancestry in a negative way to disempower you.
Yeah, to disarm you and make you servants of my will, exactly. And so one last character I do want to talk about here is Salat, one of my favorite characters. He appears several times. He is a character from Kushan, and he has some monks with him. He's like a very ninja type of guy, but more importantly, he seems to be another one that can leap out of the river of fate. He's very similar to Guts in that way.
Yeah, he's like an Eastern manifestation of Guts, right?
Yeah, he really is, and he helps Rickard here. Rickard run after he slaps Griffith. Obviously, Rickard can't just be there anymore, so he runs. No, and Salat helps him get out of the city.
Upon slapping Griffith, Rickard's balls never stopped growing from that point on.
And so he can't
And
really
so
run.
he has now integrated himself into the main story inextricably, and
So he's just
there's no
drag
taking him out of the main
his balls
plot
are
line.
just dragging, making a trail on the ground. He's got the dragon balls, if you will.
What I'm saying is that his balls have an orbit, and main characters are drawn into it. The story is now going to rotate around how big his fucking balls are because he slapped Griffith in the fucking face.
And so Salat has to help him, well, obviously. So he helps him get out. But I did want to mention Salat because he is akin to Guts in that way. He also is he didn't side with Ganishka. He actually went against Ganishka's orders. He didn't like Ganishka because Ganishka was unholy. And even though Salat, let's say he's malaligned to Guts, it adds a level of nuance to say that just because someone is not aligned with our hero doesn't mean that they are necessarily evil. Because Salat actually doesn't have any of the unholy trinity.
Other than the identification with the ego, right?
Well, I mean, let's talk about deceit, arrogance, resentment. He may be a little bit arrogant, but as far as deceit, he's not lied.
Right.
Right? And resentment, definitely not resentment. In fact, when he encounters resentment is when he goes against his home country and thereby actually escapes the wrath of Griffith.
Mm-hmm. Right. And he kind of exists as this figure that transcends the struggle of the main story. And it's a really great way for us to tie Rickard in to the tides of fate, so to speak.
And to say that Salat is meaningful. I none of these characters are there for no reason. I actually think this is the second to last or last. I think we have a couple more.
We got a few more.
I think we've already talked about one of them, though. We're going to skip that one. So we're talking about Serpico in this one. This is another enemy of Guts here. And I wanted to talk about Serpico because he is that spirit which protects society and etiquette. And it is opposed to Guts initially because the hero's spirit can destroy society and etiquette and reform it to something new. Serpico is the spirit which conserves. You could say Serpico is a super conservative. And he goes against Guts for just that reason. And why I say this is because Farnese, who is very conservative, religious, and does what she's told in the beginning, is liberated by interacting with the spirit of Guts. And by doing so, Serpico is not happy about that and fights Guts multiple times because of that exact reason.
Well, I think that's to say that Serpico, being a spirit that protects the feminine spirit that Farnese is trying to emulate, that he recognizes the danger in the shadow that Guts is embodying, right?
Right, and that's what I mean. So Serpico, you could say, is like the overprotective father figure.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so he challenges Guts multiple times before Farnese is able to truly interact. And I'm a little sad we're not going to see what happens to my boy Serpico.
Yeah, Serpico is he's probably the first. He's not a real challenger to Guts, but he's a rival to Guts in a way because he's smart.
Well, and that's the thing. That which protects society constantly challenges that which threatens society, which Guts, introducing the ideas of the integration of the shadow, causes stability in society and therefore must be mitigated.
Yeah, I mean, he is sort of a cultural corrective measure, you could say, with Farnese really being the sort of religious interpretation of what a woman should be, right? And her reaction to what Guts represents.
Farnese is the future at stake.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, not no spoilers, definitely spoilers. Eventually, Farnese joins Guts to take the big risk of gambling the future on magic and
Yeah.
faith, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. She begins with faith that's unfounded, and she ends with faith that is real.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why her original interaction with nature itself she has the identification with chaos, right? And so whenever she's confronted with that, there's this very strange scene where she's tempting Guts to kill her, but it's like manifested as a very sexual thing, and I think that's because Guts wielding the Dragon Slayer, he is that which confronts chaos, and she comes into contact with the idea that there's an archetypal truth to the feminine relating to the chaos, right?
And she's so overwhelmed that she would rather die and be unconscious than face that fact. And
Serpico is sort of this societal barrier to try to protect that.
Yeah. Even if it's unhealthy. Serpico is not a moral actor either way. He doesn't care. It doesn't matter. As long as he is protecting the society and the femininity that he has been ascribed to. So let's continue. We got some mermaid. Oh yeah, my boy Ishidoro getting some fish pussy. Yeah.
I love this idea with Isidoro because the mermaid, we talked about this a little bit in Dragon Ball as well, but the mermaid representing the siren, right? The siren's call.
That which is attractive but cannot fulfill.
Or that which attracts but cannot copulate, which cannot perpetuate the human story. And also the water being tied to the unconscious. And so it's sort of this, it's almost a masturbatory thing where the unconscious call of the feminine weakens the masculine. It's like, beware the siren's call, right? And so for that to be this manifestation that ties into Isidoro's character is sort of to say that, like, maybe he ties into the current generation's experience of the relationship between the masculine and feminine. And, with him being a student of Guts, it's like, well, maybe there's something about his relationship to women that he needs to learn from Guts. And that's why we have this character spawning as a sort of relation to him.
And it's actually, I think, more healthy that this way is how he's introduced to it. And the mermaid, and she can turn into an actual girl.
Yeah, and she's not just a mermaid, right?
She's not just a mermaid, and that's a big thing. But it doesn't matter because Ishidora was never going to end up with her anyways. Ishidora is always going to end up with Shirke. I'm a huge shipper of those two. They were always going to end up together, pretty much destined for each other.
I think of her more in the same way that I think of, like, Puar with Yamcha, right?
Oh, yeah. The mermaid girl, yeah.
Yeah.
But Shirke,
no.
that's the real deal.
Well, Shirka being the creative aspect of the feminine, right?
Yeah, and Ishidoro being that logos-oriented masculine. And, in fact, logos-oriented, if you read those last chapters, how enlightened Ishidoro seems from when he first appears, if you think about it.
Right, and we see his mode of being as something that
is formidable
to the witches.
Yeah.
As formidable to the creative feminine.
Exactly.
But this being introduced to him is the whole purpose of the boat arc, I think. People don't really understand the purpose of the boat arc, and they say, oh, it was a waste of time for like a year.
So the ship arc.
Yeah, so the ship arc is really about shipping these two.
Well, it's about Ishidoro learning about the feminine. It's also sailing on that unconscious, and it's about
integrating that unconscious.
Right, and they fight the pirates and they fight the god of the sea and all that.
Yeah, the god of the sea being really important.
Yes, and I don't think we have any clips of that.
No.
But to say that they begin to integrate themselves with each other, and there's a lot of character growth on the ship.
Yeah, that's why she comes along,
and she comes
and
along,
then shows back up whenever they're in the
And unfortunately, I would say
in
her
the elf
purpose
world.
is to help Ishidoro begin to develop his relationship with the feminine so that he and Shirke can be together. And I mean, Shirke has a huge crush on Guts, which is cute.
But he needs to become Guts so that
But
he can be worthy of
and
Shirka's affection.
exactly, and it won't happen yet. And in fact, I loved, like, you could so see it in the last couple of chapters.
Oh,
Like,
it's great.
oh, it
It's
was so
so
good.
good
Oh,
in the
man.
last couple chapters with the two of them.
I'm so sad. Let's just continue. I can't do much more. I'm so sad, Bob. I'm so sad, Brock. I'm so sad.
I wanted to get a couple of shots here because this is one of like 100 different representations of this.
Oh, and Dark Souls for
that
sure. Yeah.
Dark Souls is spawned from Berserk. There's no denying it. Don't even try to convince me.
No contriving it. No flying it.
There's a million different mobs. You think of bone wheel skeletons. I mean, there's so many different things.
Yeah.
But the spirit of Dark Souls, the whole idea, the mechanical idea of Dark Souls, of not going hollow.
Whoa. Because I will say Dark Souls innovated some things, because the idea of not going hollow despite dying over and over is not something conveyed in Berserk, because it can't be. I mean,
it's an extension of an idea in Berserk.
Well, it's an extension of an idea abstracted from the struggles that we go through in life. So think about like what Dr. Peterson talks about Deadwood, and how you have to burn part of yourself. Burn part of yourself in the bonfire to become stronger, right?
Right. Well,
it is an integration of those ideas with the ideas and symbolism of Berserk, and we obviously see the Taurus demon here. I would say that it's hard. It's actually pretty tough to say, because there's no idea of evil in Dark Souls.
Right. You have to use the bonfire to keep your humanity active, you know. And there's an idea of that. And it's across so many different factors of Dark Souls. And you know, we had talked about how without windmills, we probably would have never even known each other. And that's all because Dark Souls took these ideas from Berserk and tried to build on them and tried to integrate them into a player experience so that they could. I think that it's so that Miyazaki could try to extrapolate on those ideas and make them relatable to people and make them experience them.
Yeah, and I mean, what better way to make them relatable than have the people experience them themselves? And so another game that allows that is Bloodborne. This is the Hunter's Mark and the Rune of Sacrifice on Diaz's neck. And it's obviously an homage to it.
Yeah, it's very tied in. You know, once Guts has accepted the brand of sacrifice,
Accepted.
Well, I say
he had
accepted.
no choice.
Once Guts has integrated the brand of sacrifice, I should say, as a part of his existence, he's constantly fighting demons and slaying them so that he can continue existing in the world. And as a hunter, the hunter's mark is shown as a representation of a body being drained of its blood being the thing that you're trying to collect to offer up to the moon presence tying into the unconscious, and the cycle continuing itself. There's a lot to it, but
I would also mention that the Hunter's Mark ties the hunter to the hunter's dream and imprisons them there, much like the Rune of Sacrifice is a mark of damnation, let's say.
Yeah,
but it is
forever ties them
yeah.
to the eclipse, right?
Right, exactly, and they'll always be hunted for it, and so the hunters as well would always be forced to hunt by existing in the hunter's
right,
dream.
and it is the same idea that's like, you know, you think even down to like Alice in Wonderland, which says that in this world you have to run as fast as you can to stay alive. It's the hunter's mark. If you are a hunter, you are also the sacrifice. You are the hunted. And accepting your role as the hunter is to understand the nature of the necessity of the hunt in the archetypal hero story. And so it is the Ouroboros eating of the tail in a way as well, understanding your role in the cosmos. So it's extremely deep, and I think that we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. But I did want to just bring this in because
Blurn.
it's so tied into that archetypal story.
Here it is, Blurn. I briefly wanted to mention Geyseric, Skull Knight, and the historical references there. And so, between the fall of the Roman Empire and really Charlemagne's time, which is about 300, 400 years, give or take. I'd say about 300, actually. About 300 years. There was an era of a lot of disintegration, and warlords roamed about. Geyseric, and this loosely is somewhat historical, as in Berserk tries to be somewhat historical. But Skull Knight had to sacrifice, and we actually saw that in some of the last chapters that Miura released for us.
In fact, the last chapter.
Yeah. Geyseric sacrificed everyone for, well, we don't know. But point being, I just wanted to mention the historical significance because there were warlords at that time, and specifically Geyseric, I think, is a warlord that ruled, I think, in Brittany and northern France. I could be wrong. It may be Gascony or maybe Saxony. I actually don't remember where he conquered, but he conquered a good area of land. But Geyseric is actually a real person. And it's interesting to mention the historical significance.
Well, I want to tie it in a couple of different ways before we finish this up, which is that the depiction of Geyseric is very similar to the depiction in Dark Souls 3 of the Nameless King. And Geyseric is the Nameless King originally when we're introduced to him in Berserk, if you recall. There's definitely an aspect of where we originally see from the rescue of Griffith the idea that Geyseric represents as this sort of mysterious king figure who sacrificed all of the city that came before, or you could think of it like an old ancient Yharnam type space, in the same vein that we're tying it into Bloodborne. Or New Londo versus, Londo. And so it's definitely interesting that way, where you think of Gwyn and his relationship to the Firstborn or the Nameless King, and the concept of Gwyn versus what Geyseric would represent, or Skull Knight then as a representation of Geyseric would represent in this intergenerational story that Berserk is trying to convey.
Right, and I think the reason that Skull Knight is immortal is that because he's devoted his spirit to be against that which causes corruption. And as noble as that is, it's still a flawed way of going about it, because without leading by example and propagating your spirit into the world, it's not going to be able to cause the difference that you otherwise could. It's basically a saying of the pen is mightier than the sword. The idea that you propagate is more powerful than the force that you can exert individually.
And it's also to say that Skull Knight is the thing that stops Guts and Casca from just being a sacrifice.
Yes, that's true, and it is that idea that that conviction which saves them. But let's get on to the end. We have one more panel. I'm just gonna skip the last.
Yeah,
we already
it was
talked
just an
about.
extra.
We already talked about Void, so
we already know what Void is.
We're gonna go to the last one. One of my saddest panels here. It's when Casca sees Guts for I guess the last time.
One of the last, yeah. She's seeing the shadow of Guts. Because really, for her to persist in the world as she did beyond what happened with Griffith, she could not contextualize the shadow. She couldn't conceptualize it. And so, as she becomes more integrated with herself here, and conscious again, as the Logos is reintegrated as it is, then she sees Guts for all of the negative that he's done. I mean, and we see that the Beast of Darkness has caused damage to Casca, you know.
Right, but I mean, it's not just that. It's the very presence of Guts is intertwined with the trauma that she's experienced. Meaning, right, that when the hero, even if the hero is able to confront the evil and survive, that doesn't mean that all those party to the event will be spared. And it's a tragic message, but it's a message that is absolutely true. I mean, think about historically, right? Heroic deeds in battle have saved lives, but they haven't saved everyone. And specifically, they can't do much against the psychological trauma inflicted by true malevolence. And in this instance, it's really sad to see, because Guts has tried his hardest to rectify some of the issues that he's caused himself and help Casca get over the pain she's felt from Griffith's actions. Still not enough.
Right. Well, you know, very similar to the frame of void that we're not talking about. When she looks at Guts, she sees him as a shadow in front of the eclipse. And part of that is that in order for him to carry her across this nihilistic world that sprung up from the success of Griffith's mode of being, he has had to integrate a lot of his shadow. And she sees that in him, and it's crippling to her. And so that, you know, it's to say that, like, again, Guts has sacrificed half of himself to get here. His eye has been gouged out. His feminine side has been stricken down. When she sees him as the shadow, as a negative thing, right?
As a monster, yeah.
As a monster, truly. And it's not so simple for her to just be reintegrated into himself. Because again, remember that she is the nourishing element for him. She is the thing that redeems him, in a sense, right? The feminine redeeming the masculine element. And it's not so easy for him to be redeemed now, because he's integrated a lot of his shadow elements. And if she is going to, again, represent that redemption and represent that integration for him, she can't just see him as wholly positive. And unfortunately, we don't get to see that get redeemed again. I think that that's where it was going, you know.
I hoped so, because
they even talked about it in the story that there was a way to heal her mind.
I was rooting for my boy Guts, and he tried so hard, and it was never his fault. And that's the other thing. It was never his fault, but it's still his responsibility. He can't leave Casca, and that's what's established after the Black Swordsman arc with the conviction arc, is that he has conviction. He can no longer abandon those to pursue a nihilistic, revengeful, resentful mode of being. And this is his reward, and it's an explanation upon the world's actions and how it's not fair, and it will never be fair. And it doesn't matter what you do. Sometimes things just won't work out. And when Skull Knight told him that Casca may not want what he wants, it was a foretelling. And we may not figure out what happens, but it was going to be bittersweet in either way.
Again, as Guts is the inverted but necessary representation of the self in a Christ-like figure, this is the final breaking off of something exterior to himself that he can identify as. Without Casca, he truly can only be one person, and that's himself.
And he has some scenes after this which actually really help him solidify after the debasing that he goes under at this point.
And it has to do with his integration of the wisdom of what came before with the Skull Knight and Geyseric.
Right. And we'd love to get into that, but we'll have our own series on Berserk. We just wanted to mention some of our favorite moments. Some of the most impactful things for us. We're both huge Berserk fans. Berserk is up there. It's up there with Dragon Ball for sure. It's mythological in nature.
Yeah, there's no denying it. I mean,
And thank you, Miura. Thank you so much. I don't know what else to say. You got any words, Brock?
yeah, I mean, without Miura, we wouldn't even be friends.
Yeah, I mean, just besides on a personal level, just it's so amazing to see an artist so dedicated to his work.
He was a true conduit for the archetypes, you know.
Yeah, and some of the interviews pretty much solidify what Peterson had said, and that's to say that necessarily artists cannot articulate exactly what it is they're writing. And it's true. I mean, Miura during some interviews wasn't able to do that, but he is able to communicate with the muses and create a masterpiece such as Berserk. And though it will remain unfinished, it will still be one of the greatest pieces of fiction that I've ever experienced and incorporated into my literary lexicon.
Yeah, I mean, and that's to say that fiction is our attempt to tell a story that is the commonality across multiple
Iterations.
stories in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to say something truer than what's in reality. And I think that whenever fiction finds that nature, whenever it attunes to something that is more true than reality, in the same way that mathematics is a more real representation of anything in the physical world, right? When it aligns with something that true, it is truly archetypal. It is something that is more real and is more relevant to more people than a true story could be.
And I think what Brock means by real is something which, if you acted as if it was true, it would benefit you further than something that may possibly be physically true, but may not benefit you if you act as if it were.
Right. It's something that you can gain more from than even if you were to read into the actions of something that happened historically. It's to take the commonality of historical events and tell you a more significant story that's even more relevant to you by that nature. And I think that Berserk taps into that archetypal substructure in a way that few artists do. And I think that we have experienced something truly tragic in the loss of Kentaro Miura.
Rest in peace. We'll miss you, Miura. And I think that's just about all we have.
Yeah.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe. This is kind of just a rambling, off-the-cuff video. It's going to be sad to not see the end of Berserk. But at the same time, I think Miura deserves the rest.
Yeah, I think he's inspired so many people. And even in...
And we're going to see some great art coming out from these people that have been inspired by Miura.
I've heard it already from people.
It's
I heard it in a podcast I listened to today, that somebody was inspired and they knew because of this that they no longer had any excuse not to create their own art and to contribute to the conversation.
I mean, what opportunity do you have? Miura gave it his all for all he could. So, I mean, his spirit is something worthy of admiration and something worthy of trying to embody. So, go for it. And if you like what you heard, subscribe. Give us a like.
Click on the bell.
Kalunga the bunga, chunga the wunga.
Come to our Patreon that doesn't exist and give us the money that we're not going to get from you.
I guess we may make a Patreon eventually.
Someday.
We'll need some more subscribers first.
No, that's not the purpose of this.
That's not obviously. We're just trying to. I mean, we're trying to express ideas that we're very passionate about. But I think we're gonna wrap it up here.
Yeah.
This was Get the Mic, off the cuff video. Rest in peace, Miura. Kentaro Miura, creator of Berserk. I'm your host on the left.
I'm your host on the right.
And we hope everyone stays safe.